There are wills that are read like a blessing, and wills that are read like a dare, and this one was read on a wet gray morning at the tail of a Sussex winter, in the first-floor chambers of an attorney off the High Street in Lewes, in the raw early spring of the year 1817, with the rain coming down the tall sash windows in long, slow ropes and the coal in the grate, hissing where a leak had found it, and it was read while a stout gentleman in claret broadcloth was already on his feet, already half across the room, his soft pink hand flat upon the green baize of the table, as though a man could hold a sentence still by pressing it. "There is an error here, sir," he was saying, "an error or a fraud, or the wandering of a sick old man's mind. You will go back and read it again from the top." While the woman the whole matter turned upon sat apart from them all by the streaming window, in a russet brown wool gown that had been turned once and made over twice, and did not so much as move her head. And I want you, before we go a single step further into that cold, bright room, to look at her the way I have learned to look at her, for she is the reason there is a tale to tell at all. Her name was Judith Ferrers, and she was 27 that spring. A slender, upright young woman with her dark auburn hair drawn back off a browned and faintly ruddy face into a plain low knot under an undyed linen cap, clear gray eyes set level under dark brows, and a fine pale old burn scar drawn like a thread across the back of one forearm where the sleeve was turned to the elbow, and where any other gentlewoman in that predicament might have been wringing a handkerchief or watching the attorney's mouth for the shape of ruin, Judith Ferrers was watching the light. She was watching the exact pewter color of the wet glass, the way the March sky lay gray upon gray behind the running water, one shade over another, and she was reading it the way another woman might tell the beads of a rosary through her fingers without once looking down. Because Judith Ferrers could not sit in a room and not read the color of a thing, could not look at gray water on gray cloud without her mind laying it, of its own accord and against her will, against the far hotter grays she had known all her life, the dull gray of cold iron on the stone, the darker gray of a scale just fallen, the first faint red that creeps up into black metal when the fire has begun to have its way. She had been taught to read heat by its color before she had been taught her catechism, and a soul taught that young never after loses the trick of it, so that a rain-washed window and a bar drawn from the fire were, to her, only two readings on the one long scale. And she sat and read the cold one and waited for the man to finish, and gave the room nothing. And it was Mr. Anselm Raysbury who was reading, a spare, upright man of 63 in plain black superfine gone shiny at the elbow, gold-rimmed spectacles pushed up onto his brow, and a client's ledger tucked under his left arm as though it had grown there. A slow, courteous man who had buried more of his clients than he liked to number, and had learned long ago to read a will straight through any weather of interruption as a good helmsman holds his course through a squall, and he did not stop for the fleshy protesting gentleman at his elbow. He only waited a beat, and drew his spectacles down from his brow onto his nose, and looked over the gold rims and said, "Missa Sowerby, you shall have your hearing, sir, upon my word you shall. But the dead man has the first word by right and by law, and you will let me give it him." And then he went back to the paper and read on in a dry level voice that gave no more weight to the line that made a woman than to the line that broke a man, which is the one truly merciless way to read to a person who is praying the words, "will bend." And here I must give you the dead man, though he was already 3 days in the ground of Hartsfield churchyard under a green mound with the turf not yet knit, because he stands behind every word of what follows, and you had best carry his face with you. Abel Ferrers, master smith, gone at the age of 70 in the depth of the winter just past, a very big, broad-shouldered old man even at the end, with thick white hair and a short white beard and a broad weather-reddened, deeply lined face, and deep-set gray eyes, the very gray his granddaughter wore now by the window, set kind in all that wreckage of years. A man who had worn a soot-blackened, cracked leather apron over an open-collared oatmeal shirt for 50 years and more, whose forearms had been thick and scarred as old oak roots, and whose two great hands had made half the good ironwork between the Weald and the sea, gates and screens and weather vanes and the fine church work that outlives the men who commission it. That was the man whose voice, dry and folded up now into Mr. Raysbury's dry reading, went on filling the cold chamber. I give and devise. Raysbury read, all that my forge and smithy and works known as Hartsfield Forge, together with the cottage and garden and the close of ground adjoining, and all my anvils, hearths, bellows, tools, stock of iron and of charcoal, and the whole mystery and goodwill of the trade thereof, situate at Hartsfield on the northern edge of the moor, in this county of Sussex. And further I give the oak chest kept in the winding press of the cottage, being my pattern book, and my book of receipts written in my own hand and my own manner, which is worth more than all the rest of it laid together to the one pair of hands that can read it, and which I charge my heir to keep close and to read, all of which I give unto my granddaughter Judith Ferrers, spinster, absolutely, and to her own use. And there the old attorney paused, not for the drama of it, for Raysbury was no more a man for drama than a milestone is, but because the next was the sting. And he was too old and too honest a hand not to let the sting be heard clean. But this my gift, he read on, is upon one condition, and the condition is the whole of it, that the great pair of wrought iron gates which I was commissioned by the parish to make for the rebuilt church at Hartsfield, and which lie in my shop at my death unfinished, shall be finished, forged whole and watered true, and hung upon their hooks in the stone piers before the church door. And that this be done, and the gates be standing and swinging on their hangings before the day the church is rehallowed at Whitsun next. And if my granddaughter shall do this thing, then is the whole of my estate hers, without let or question. But if at that day the gates be not made and hung, then the forge, and the cottage, and the works, and the goodwill, and every last file, and rod and clinker of it shall pass over entire to my cousin's son Gideon Sowerby, ironmaster, of the town of Robertsbridge, to have and to hold as his own. There the reading stopped, and into the stopping the fire hissed and the rain ran, and Gideon Sowerby let out a breath through his nose that was very like a man setting down a heavy box he has carried a long way and is glad to be rid of. And you had best see him whole this once, so that we need never stop to draw him again. Gideon Sowerby, 44, a portly, soft-fleshed man gone high in the color, with thinning sandy hair combed with great care across a pink scalp, small pale calculating blue eyes that did their reckoning while the rest of the face smiled, and soft pink hands that had never in his life been truly blackened by the trade he lived off. Though he called himself an ironmaster, and owned 3 fires and 40 men, and never lifted a hammer at one of them, dressed that morning richly for the country in a claret plum tail coat and a straining buff waistcoat, a heavy gold watch chain looped across his belly, and a cluster of fob seals that he turned and turned in his fingers as he spoke, and upon his mouth a thin, oiled half-smile that came and went and never once climbed as far as his eyes. He turned his seals now, and he let the smile come, and he did not so much argue with the will as gather it up gently, the way a man gathers up something already broken. "Well," he said, and the voice was soft and warm and full of a terrible reasonableness, Well, there it is. And a sad thing it is. And I'll not pretend before this company that it is anything but a sad old man's fancy. For you all knew Abel, and you know he was a great smith and a stubborn one. And you know how the two of them doted, the old man and the girl. And it is no wonder to me at all that at the last, with the fever on him and the shop gone cold, he should dream a dream of her keeping it on. But dreams are one thing, gentlemen, and iron is another, and I say it with no unkindness in the world to my cousin here. And he inclined the sandy head a half-inch toward the window without truly looking at her. There is not, and there has never been in the memory of any guild or company in this kingdom, a woman suffered to hold the mystery of iron. It is not a cruelty. It is a fact, as much a fact as that a wren does not draw a plow. The forge is the trade of strong men, guild sworn and years prenticed, men who have broken their bodies at the anvil since they were boys, and the making of church gates, watered gates, gates with the pattern welded up in them, work that half the sworn masters between here and London could not do and would not dare attempt. That is not a labor a young woman takes up out of grief and love. However good her heart, it is a thing to break her, is what it is. Break her health and her purse and her name together, and leave her at Whitsun with a cold shop and a heap of spoiled iron and nothing to sell but the pity of her neighbors. There was a murmur in the room at that, and it is worth your knowing who murmured. For the chamber was not empty. Raysbury had done Abel the courtesy, or perhaps the old smith had asked it, of having witnesses by and among them. Ranged along the wall in their good coats with their hats on their knees, sat 4 or 5 of the sworn men of the Smiths' company out of Lewes and Robertsbridge, come partly to see fair play, and partly, if we are honest, to see the thing settled the way they were sure it must be. And when Gideon spoke of the wren and the plough, one of them laughed, a short, good-humored laugh, not cruel, which is somehow worse than cruel. The laugh of a man at a notion so plainly against nature that it can only be a joke, and the laugh ran along the wall and was taken up and set down again, and one grizzled master shook his head and said, half under his breath but not meaning it to be unheard, that he had struck iron 40 year and would give a guinea to see the maid so much as light the grate hearth alone, let be draw a weld. And Gideon Sowerby smiled his half-smile at the wall and let the laughter be his argument, for it was a better argument than any he could have made himself. And now, because this is that kind of tale, and because you and I are going to sit a long while together by this fire before we are done, for it is a long road from a cold shop in March to the thing I mean to show you, I will do what I always do, and tell you plainly, before ever the wheel begins to turn, which way it comes round, for the pleasure of a slow true story was never in the surprise of the end, but in the long sure watching of the end arrive, in seeing every stone that was laid to stop a thing become, in the end, a step it climbed by. So here it is, and you may hold me to it. Before the hawthorn was white on the moor's edge, before the Whitsun bells rang out over Hartsfield, the very men laughing along that wall, the ones who called her the smith's girl, the spinster, the old man's folly, the woman who thought grief could beat iron, those same men would stand bareheaded in the churchyard and look up at a pair of gates hung true and swinging in their piers. Gates with the watered steel run silver as moonlight along every leaf and scroll of them, and they would know, every man of them, that no shop in the county but Hartsfield had the making of that iron, and no hand but one, and Gideon Sowerby, who turned his seals so easily that morning and spoke so warm of his cousin's broken health, would put out into the light of that same Whitsun morning the one thing he had truly hoarded all his life, and have it read out of the room to his ruin before the whole parish and the magistrate both. But all of that was yet unstruck, folded up in the weeks ahead like a pattern still hidden in a stacked billet. And on this morning Judith Ferrars owned nothing in the wide world but a made-over gown, a case of her grandfather's finest gravers and files rolled in flannel, a scarred forearm, a good eye for heat, and a stubbornness she wore so far down and so still that nearly every soul who met her took it for meekness and was wrong. She had said not one word through all of it. She had let Sowerby talk of wrens and plows and broken health, and she had let the master smiths laugh, and she had gone on reading the pewter light down the glass, 1 and 2 and 3, 1 and 2 and 3, and only when Mr. Raysbury had squared his papers and said, gently, for he was fond of her in his dry old way, that she need not answer this hour, that she might take a day, take a week, that there was no shame and much sense in a young woman looking hard at a thing before she set her hand to it. Only then did she turn her head from the window, and it was seen that her gray eyes were perfectly dry. She asked him one thing, and one only. She asked whether the pattern book, the oak chest her grandfather had charged her keep, was already hers, this hour, condition or no condition, whether that at least could not be taken from her, whatever befell at Whitsun. And Raysbury looked at her over the gold rims a moment, and something moved in the old careful face, and he said that yes, by the plain words of it. The chest and its book were given her absolutely and out of the condition, hers to keep whether the gates were made or no. Then she nodded once, as a person nods who has found the one beam in a burning house that will bear weight, and she said, in a voice not raised at all, that she thanked him, and that she would try the gates. Mr. Sowerby stopped turning his seals. Cousin, he said, and the warmth in it thickened. Cousin, be advised, and he named a figure, then and there before the company, a fair price, he called it, a generous price. For her to sign away the trying of it clean, and walk out of that room with money in her hand, and her health in her body, and no year of ruin ahead of her, he would take the forge off her, gates and all, this very day, and she need never go near the cold shop again, never blister those good hands, never give the parish and the county the spectacle of a woman failing at a man's mystery. Let her take the money, he said, and go be a governess or a music mistress somewhere warm and dry, and remember her grandfather kindly, and let the iron go to the hands God plainly meant it for. And Judith Ferrars looked at him then, fully, for the first time that morning, with those level gray eyes that were her grandfather's eyes, and she looked at him the way she would have looked at a bar somebody swore to her was good steel, looked at him as if she were reading his color, and finding it cold short, and finding it false all the way through, and she said only, no, cousin, I thank you, but no. The gates were his to leave, and they are mine to make, and I will make them, or I will fail at them with my own hands and no others, and either way you shall not buy them from me this morning. And that was all. She signed her name to the trying of it where Raysbury set the paper and showed her the place, Judith Ferrars, in a firm upright hand, with the letters drawn a little deep, the hand of a woman used to marking metal that will not take a light stroke. And she gathered up her flannel roll of gravers and her gray wool shawl, and she made her curtsy to the old attorney and none at all to her cousin, and she went out down the stairs and into the wet, while behind her the company breathed out, and Gideon Sowerby put on his hat and said, to no one in particular but to all of them, in a voice gone suddenly smaller and harder now the smile was let fall, that they would see that grief was a great deal cheaper than charcoal, and that he would send his cart to Hartsfield the day after Whitsun and not an hour later. She did not hear him. She was already out under the low gray sky, mounting the borrowed cob a neighbor's boy held for her at the foot of the high street, drawing her shawl close against a wind that had turned since morning and carried now a mean spitting sleet slantwise up the street off the downs, and she turned the horse's head north and west, out of Lewes and up the long climbing lanes toward the moor's edge. And she rode the better part of the short gray afternoon with the sleet stinging her brown cheek and melting cold down her collar, up out of the water meadows and the snug flint villages into the higher, harder country of gorse and bracken and birch, where the farms grew fewer, and the woods came down close to the road, reading the sky the whole way as another traveler might read the mileposts, watching the primrose pale glow where the sun stood hidden low behind the cloud sink and thin toward the early dark. And it was near that failing hour, where the lane came over the shoulder of a bracken hill and turned down through a stand of leafless birch, that she reined in of her own accord, without meaning to, the way you stop without deciding to, when a thing you have carried in your mind a long while is suddenly there before your eyes. For below her in the fold of the hill lay Hartsfield Forge. She had not seen it since the burying. It sat long and low and dark on the birch and bracken edge of the falling ground, a smithy of old soot-blackened stone with a tall, crumbling red brick chimney stack standing up stark and cold against the last of the light. No thread of smoke at its head, no red glow at any window, only the dead gray shape of it, and beside it the little tile-roofed cottage with its one dark window. And about the both of them the bare spring woods going blue with dusk, and the wide-changing Weldon sky above scudding low and gray and spitting its sleet down over the whole quiet ruin of the place. A year the fire had been out of that hearth. She could see even from the lane, even in the dying light, how the weather had got into the yard, how the woodpile had slumped, and the thatch of the lean-to had gone black and green together. She could all but feel, from up there in the wet saddle, the cold that would be standing in those stones, the deep-settled cold of a house where no fire has burned through a winter, the cold that gets into the very anvil so that it steals the heat out of the iron. You lay on it and gives you nothing back, and any sensible soul looking down on that dead gray shop in the sleet, with a great watered pair of church gates to raise out of it by Whitson, and not a striker nor a shilling nor a sworn man in the whole county who would set hand to the trying, would have turned the horse and ridden back down to the warm-lit town, and taken Gideon Sowerby's fair price and been glad of it. Judith Ferrars sat her borrowed horse in the failing light and looked a long while down at the cold chimney of the place where her grandfather had taught her to read the color of fire, and she did not turn back. She gathered the wet reins in her scarred hand, and she clicked her tongue to the cob, and she rode down the last of the lane toward the dead forge in the dark. The lane down to Hartsfield had not been mended in a 12-month, and the sleet had worked it into a brown pudding of clay and last year's leaf mold that pulled at the mare's fetlocks and slowed her to a picking walk, so that Judith Ferrars came down the last of the hill at the pace of a woman who is in no hurry to arrive, which was not the truth of it, for she was in a very great hurry indeed. Only the hurry was of the kind that lives behind the ribs and shows nothing to the weather. She had signed her name in a cold room in Lewes not 3 hours since, had put the pen down on the attorney's blotting sand, and had felt her cousin's small pale eyes upon the back of her neck the whole while. And she had asked for no dinner and taken none, and had ridden out through the shutting town and up over the wet shoulder of the down with the sleet coming sideways off the sea and stinging her cheek like grit. And now here at the foot of it all was the forge, and she reined in at the broken gate of the yard, and sat and looked at it the way she had learned as a girl to look at a length of bar before ever she laid a hand to it, reading it whole before she read it in parts. It was a long, low building of Wealden sandstone, gone the color of a wet crow. The roof of hand-made tiles sunk and sway-backed over the ridge tree, where 2 seasons of rain had rotted a purlin, and at the near end the great brick chimney stack stood up crumbling and streaked and dead, with no thread of smoke in it and no smell of smoke about it, which to Judith was the loudest thing in all that silent yard. For a working forge is never truly cold and never truly quiet, and this one was both, and had been both since the December morning her grandfather had gone out to lay his fire and had sat down instead upon the anvil stump and had not risen again. She swung down stiff from the saddle, her russet skirts heavy with wet at the hem, and she led the mare in over the churned threshold of the yard and tied her under the lean to where a little dry hay still lay. And then she stood a moment with her hand flat on the sodden black door of the smithy before she pushed it, as a person will lay a hand on a coffin lid, not from fear, but from a plain wish to be certain of the thing beneath. And then she pushed, and the door dragged and shrieked on its dropped hinge, and she went in out of the light into the cold breath of the dead shop. It smelled of rust and old ash and damp brick and the sweetish rot of wet leather, and under all of it, very faint, the ghost of coal smoke that will not leave a place though a whole year go by. And she stood in the gray doorway light and let her eyes come round to it slowly, and there it all was. The great hearth stood at the far wall under the throat of the chimney, a broad waist-high bench of stone and fire brick with the tire hole in its cheek where the blast came through. And the fire-bed in it was a cold gray saucer of last year's clinker and ash, undisturbed, with the shape still pressed in it where a fire had been banked and left and never woken, and Judith looked at that pressed gray shape a long moment, because she knew whose hand had banked it. Beside the hearth on its worn oak stump squatted the anvil, and it was a very great one, a 200-weight London pattern anvil with a good long horn and a wide face, black now with a bloom of orange rust across the face where the tools should have kept it bright as a shilling, and it sat there enormous and silent and patient, the way a good anvil will outlast 4 generations of the men who ring it. And she went to it before she went to anything else, and laid her bare palm flat upon its cold cheek, and the cold of it went up her arm and settled somewhere behind her breastbone. She knew this anvil. She had stood on a stool to reach its face before she was tall enough to reach it flat-footed. To the right of the hearth hung the ruin of the great bellows, the double-chambered leather lung that fed the fire its wind, and its top board had dropped askew on a broken hinge strap, and the leather of the folds had cracked and gone hard as a dried fish and split along 2 of the pleats so that it would draw no more air than a sieve holds water. And the counterweight, a smooth worn lump of Sussex ironstone on its chain, lay fallen in the ash beneath it. All down the wall behind the hearth the tools hung on their pins and nails in their old ranks, tongs of a dozen jaws for a dozen sizes of stock, flatters and set hammers and fullers and swages, a row of hand hammers from a little 4-ounce riveting hammer to the great sledges, and every last one of them was furred over with the same red rust, the working faces dulled, the halves gray and dry and starting from their eyes. And it came to her as she looked along them that a set of tools is a kind of writing too, that a man's whole trade hangs there in the order he kept them, and that no one had lifted a single one of these down in a year. And then at the dark, cold end of the shop, past the trough and the swage block, she saw the sacking. It lay over a long, low heap on trestles and on the floor beside them, coarse brown hop sacking thrown over in haste and never lifted, dark with damp and gone to green mold along its lower folds, and she knew before she crossed to it what was under it, and she crossed to it anyway. And she took a corner of the wet sacking in her iron-stained hand and drew it back, and there they were, the gates. or the beginning of the gates, the half of them, the promise of them lying broken up into its parts, and the sight of it stopped her breath for a moment, though her face never changed. There was the great frame of one leaf laid flat, the outer stiles and the top rail forged and drawn but not yet joined true. And there were the scrolls, whole armfuls of them, the forged oak leaves, each one hammered up out of the flat with its veins and its lobed edge, some finished and some but half raised, and the acorns turned and cupped, and the long-running scroll bars coiled like sleeping fern, and the beginnings of the arched overthrow that was to crown the whole between the piers. And every part of it, every leaf and stem and coil, was gone over with a fine even skin of rust the color of dried blood, so that the whole heap looked less like ironwork than like something dug up out of a barrow, some armor of a dead age. And she understood standing there exactly why no man in the county would touch it. It was not only that they held the old man's death in it, and none of them cared to finish a dead man's masterpiece and be measured against it. It was that a good half of the true labor and the whole of the secret still lay unmade in that heap. The watered steel that was to run its silver ripple down the show faces of the scrolls, and not one of them knew how it was made, for her grandfather had made it, and her grandfather was in the churchyard. And a smith will not put his name and his year to a thing he cannot finish in his own hand's honest way. And so they had all of them, journeyman and master alike, looked once at this heap of rusting glory and named it impossible and gone home, and left it lying under a hop sack for the rain to eat. Judith let the sacking down again gently over the near end, and stood with her hand resting on the cold coil of a scroll, and the memory came up in her the way the smoke ghost had come up, unbidden and whole. She was 6 or 7, and it was high summer, and the shop door stood wide to the green light off the birches, and the fire in the hearth was a small tended orange eye, and she sat on the 3-legged stool at her grandfather's knee, while the rest of the world thought her too small and too female to be anywhere but the cottage with a needle. And Abel Ferrers had upon his broad scarred knee a small book, bound in cracked black calf, and he was not reading it to her as her mother read the Psalter, in words, but was tracing along its pages with one blunt, sooty forefinger a language that was not words at all. It was a book of drawings and marks, of little sketched scrolls and leaves each, with a fringe of numbers and cramped symbols crowding round it, dots and strokes and looping ligatures that stood, she came to learn, for heats and colors and the counts of folds and the weights of stock, a whole trade set down in a cipher that Abel Ferrers had built for himself out of 40 years, so that no rival's eye reading over his shoulder at a fair should ever carry his mysteries home. And he had looked down at her that summer's day out of his deep-set, kind gray eyes that were the twin of her own, and he had said, in the slow way he had, "Girl, the boys have not the patience for this, and your uncle's line have not the wit, and you have both. God help you." And so it falls to you. And he had begun that day, and he had never stopped until the day he died, teaching her to read the black book, until she could take up a page cold and read a scroll off it into her mind's eye entire. The number of the bars, the order of their stacking, the heats at which they must be brought together, and the number of times the billet must be doubled and welded upon itself, all of it, so that of every living soul upon the earth she alone could open that book and hear her grandfather's voice come up out of the marks and speak the making of his iron. And the book, the pattern book, the true inheritance under and behind the false one of stone and rusted tools, was not in the shop. She knew where it was. It was in the cottage, in the small oak chest banded with iron that stood at the foot of his bed, locked, and the key of it hung even now on the thin steel chain about her own neck under her gown, where she had worn it since the burying. And this was the thing her cousin Gideon Sowerby, for all his broadcloth and his fob seals and his prosperous ironmaster's yard over at Buxted, could never have and could never use, for he might by some low means come to lay his soft pink hand upon the chest itself, and he might break its lock, and he would find within it only page upon page of a dead man's meaningless scribble, dots and strokes and looping marks that would tell him precisely nothing, because the one thing Abel Ferrars had chosen to give away in his life he had given not to the man of the family with the yard and the money, but to the girl at his knee with the patience and the wit, and that giving no will and no forgery and no gild could take back. Judith stood in the cold shop a while longer with that knowledge folded quiet in her, and then she heard, from the black end past the trough, a small dry sound of breathing that was not her own. She had thought herself alone. She was not. There was a settle against the far wall in the shadow, a cobbler's bench of a thing where a striker might sit out a cold noon, and on it, upright, wrapped in a battered leather apron gone gray with age, sat an old man so still and so much the color of the shop about him that she had taken him for a heap of sacking too. He was a wiry, knotted little old man, bald to a fringe of gray-side whisker. His forearms, where the apron fell back thick and corded all out of proportion to his small, dry frame the way a lifetime of the sledge will build a man, and one of his eyes was clouded over milky white and blind, and the other watched her. And she knew him at once, for he had been at her grandfather's Anvil as striker since before she was born. "Elias Kemp," she said, and the old man's jaw worked a moment before any word came out of it, as a pump long unused will give air before it gives water, and then he said, gruff and low, "Miss Judith," and neither of them said anything for a space. And then the old man's one good eye went past her to the cold gray hearth and the fallen bellows and the rusted rank of tools, and he said, "I keep it. Nobody bid me and nobody pays me, and I keep it. I sweep it Sundays. I cannot light it. My hands is gone for the fine work, and my eyes gone for the color. But I'll not have it stand and rot while I've legs to walk down the lane." And he stopped there, having said in that little speech more words than Judith had ever in her life heard him string together, and she understood that he had been coming down to the dead shop out of pure grief and pure stubbornness week upon week to sweep a floor no one walked on, keeping faith with a fire he could not kindle. And something in her that had held very hard and level since the cold room in Lewes gave a small dangerous turn, and she mastered it, because he would not have wanted the sight of it any more than she would. "I mean to light it, Elias," she said. "I mean to finish the gates." He looked at her out of the one eye a long while, and he did not laugh, which no other man in the Weald had failed to do. And at last he said only, "Then you'll want a striker as can still swing. For I can steady a job and I can teach a hand, but I cannot draw down a scroll bar no more." And she said, "I know it, and we shall find you help." And that was the whole of their bargain, made standing in the cold. She reckoned that night going over it on her fingers in the cottage, next to nothing to make it with. She had the freehold of the forge and the cottage and the tools and the mare and the black locked book. And she had in a knotted handkerchief in the chest 11 pounds and some odd shillings that was the whole of the ready money in the world that stood between her and the workhouse. And against that she had a great mended hearth to build, and a bellows to re-leather, and an anvil face to dress. And, above all these, iron to buy and charcoal to burn. For you cannot forge good work over sea coal that fouls the fire with its brimstone. It must be charcoal, and charcoal is dear, and 11 pounds is 11 pounds. No man of the trade would hire to her. that she already knew. For Sowerby had a long arm and a long purse, and there was not a journeyman between Luce and Tunbridge who did not know that the way to a good place in a warm yard was to leave the farrier's girl to freeze at her folly, and so on the second day, having no better plan. She walked up along the heath to the scattered farms and asked at the doors not for smiths but for hands. For any strong girl the harvest and the hiring fares had left over, any that no house would take, and she found two. She found Tamsin at the Hollow farm, a sturdy, red-cheeked, freckled girl of 16 with brown curls escaping a faded blue kerchief, and a pair of broad, capable hands that had been turned off her place for no fault but that the farmer's new wife would not keep a girl she called too bold. And Tamsin looked at the strange proposal of it, work at a forge under a woman, and looked at Judith's level gray eyes, and said she would come and be glad. For bold or no bold, she had a widowed mother, and 4 young behind her, and no other door open, and she found Bet at the very edge of the parish where the cottages give out to the gorse. A thin, pale, watchful girl of 15, with straw fair hair drawn into 2 tight plaits and wary, quiet eyes that had plainly learned young to measure a room before they trusted it. A girl the whole heath called simple, because she spoke little and stared much, though Judith, who had herself been called unnatural often enough, thought her nothing of the kind but only careful, and Bet came too, for a warm shop and a meal was more than the gorse had ever offered her. She took them on as cleaners first, and told them so honest, that there was scrubbing and scraping and carrying before ever there was iron, and paid them in their keep and a little copper she could ill spare, and set them the 3rd morning to the long filthy labor of bringing the dead shop back to something a fire could live in. And they worked, the 3 of them, in the cold with their breath smoking, hauling out a year's fallen soot and rat-nested waste and dead leaves blown under the door, scouring the trough, laying bare the good stone under the filth, while old Elias sat on his settle and steadied a tool here, and grunted a direction there, and watched the girls' hands to see which of them had the makings. And it was on the 4th day, with the shop half clean and the light going gray-gold in the late afternoon, that Judith, kneeling at the hearth working the old clinker loose from the fire-bed with a cold chisel, to see what state the fire brick was truly in beneath, heard a horse come down the churned lane, a big horse by the sound and quietly ridden, and she stood and wiped her hands on her leather apron and went to the door. And there in the yard a man had drawn rein on a big quiet iron gray and was looking at the forge, not at her, at the forge, at the crumbling stack and the sway-backed roof, the way a man looks who is reckoning a thing up honestly. He was a tall, spare, serious man of about 40 in a plain dark blue undress military coat gone a little shabby at the cuffs, a gray waistcoat under it, top boots splashed to the knee, and his dark hair was going gray at the temples, and he wore a short dark beard. And down one cheekbone ran an old thin white scar such as a sobber leaves, and his face was weather-lined and careworn and grave, and he sat his horse with a slight stiffness that spoke of an old hurt in one leg. He touched his hat to her, not low, just the plain civil dip a man gives an equal, and he said his name was Reeve, Captain Reeve, that had the tenancy of Harrow's Down over the hill this 2 years since he left the artillery, that he had been Abel Ferrers's neighbor, and had bought his gate hinges and his plowshares and his good opinion of him, and was sorry, very sorry, to have missed the funeral being from home, and Judith said what was proper and waited, for she had learned in a hard week that when a man rode down that lane there was a thing behind the civility, and it was as well to let it come. It came plainly and without ornament. "I hear," he said, looking at her levelly out of steady dark brown eyes, "that you mean to finish the church gates, and that the county has been at some pains to tell you that you cannot, and I have no opinion on whether you can. For I am a gunner and not a smith, and I never yet met the man or the woman I could measure at a trade I did not know. But I know charcoal, for I have burned enough of it in my time to serve a battery, and I have a stand of coppice up at Harrow's Down that is due for cutting and a man who can burn it, and I have a good stout cart, and a horse that will pull it, and I have, he said. And here for the first time something that was very nearly the ghost of dryness touched his grave mouth. More time upon my hands than a solitary man rightly knows the use of. If you have a use for any of that, it is at your call, at a fair price or at no price, as you please, and if you have not, you have only to say so, and I'll not trouble you again. And Judith stood in the doorway with the cold coming off the stone and looked at him and understood, quicker than she would have credited, that this was not charity and not pity, that there was not a grain of the honeyed managing softness in it that she had had by the pound all week, that it was one solitary competent person who had lost most of what he cared for holding out a plain hand to another because the work was worth doing and because he could, and that was a coin she had not been offered in so long that she scarcely knew how to take it up, and so she took it up plainly, as it was given. "I have great use for it, Captain Reeve," she said, "and I will pay you a fair price for the charcoal and be in your debt for the cart, and thank you." And he inclined his head as though a piece of ordinary business were concluded, and said he would send the first load within the week, and turned the iron gray and rode back up the lane in the failing light, and Judith watched him go and then went back to the clinker, with something not far from warmth about her, which was as well, for she was to have need of it, because 2 days after the captain's gray went up the lane, a very different horse came down it. This was a showy hired hack, and the man upon it came down out of a chaise he had left at the top where the mud began, picking his way delicate through the clay in good boots. A portly, soft-fleshed man of 44, with a high florid color and thinning sandy hair combed careful over the bare of his crown, in a claret plum broadcloth tailcoat and a buff waistcoat that strained a little at the button, a heavy gold watch chain across the swell of him, and a cluster of fob seals that his soft pink fingers turned and turned as he came, and upon his mouth sat a thin, oily half-smile that Judith had watched across an attorney's table not a week gone. Cousin Gideon walked into the yard of the forge that his own hands had never dirtied, and looked about him at the sway-backed roof and the dead stack, and the girls scrubbing at the trough, and the little half-blind striker on his settle, and he let the smile deepen sorrowfully, as a man smiles at a child's sand-castle when the tide is already turning. And he said, "Cousin Judith, I came the moment I could get free, for I could not rest thinking of you down here in the wet and the cold, ruining your health among the rust." And he shook his head slow, and he said that he had lain awake over it, that it grieved him to the heart to see his own blood set herself against a thing that not the strongest man in the guild would take on, now the old man was gone, that she must know in her sense, whatever her pride said, that these gates could never be finished by any hand in the world without the trick of the old man's steel that was buried with him, and that the merciful thing, the thing he begged her as a kinsman to do, was to let it go clean, and take the fair price he had told the attorneys he would still, out of pure family feeling, be glad to pay. Before she had spent her last shilling and her strength and her name upon a folly that all the county was already laughing at, and he stood there turning his seals with his little pale, calculating blue eyes going all the while round the shop, pricing it. And Judith stood before her grandfather's cold hearth in her scorched apron with the cold chisel still in her iron-stained hand, and heard him out to the last honeyed word. And when he was quite done, she said only, in her level, grave voice, that she thanked her cousin for his trouble in coming so far in the wet, that her health was very good, and that she had signed to try the gates and meant to try them, and that when he wished to speak with her further, he might do it through the attorneys as the will provided. And she said it so plain and so quiet, and with so little to fasten a quarrel to, that the smile came off his face by degrees like frost coming off a pane, and left underneath it for one bare moment the true thing, the flat pale look of a man doing a sum. And then he put the smile back and said he was sorry, very sorry, that she would take it so, and that she must not think he had not warned her when the winter of it came. And he turned and picked his careful way back up the mud to his waiting chaise, and Judith stood in the door and watched him go too, as she had watched the captain go, and marked well the difference in how the two of them sat a-going away. Then the short day guttered out. She sent the girls up to the cottage to their supper and their bed in the warm, and told Elias to go home to his sisters before the dark caught his blind side on the lane. And when they were all gone, and the yard was empty, and the birch wood behind was going from gray to black under a sky the color of a cold hearth, Judith Ferrars went back alone into the swept and silent shop, and stood before the great dead hearth that her grandfather had banked with his own hand on the last morning of his life and never woken. She had cleared the fire-bed down to sound brick that afternoon. Now she went along the wall in the last of the light, and took down, one from the store, a little dry kindling of birch, and a handful of the good charcoal that was left in the bottom of the old bin, hoarding it careful, for there was little enough, and she knelt at the cold stone, and she laid a fire the way she had been taught before she could read her letters, a small, careful heart of it, no more than a child's fire, no working blaze, but only the first waking of the hearth. And she took her flint and her steel and her charcloth from the tin in her apron pocket, and she struck and caught and blew, kneeling, her level gray eyes close over it, her breath long and steady the way the fire wants. And the char caught the kindling, and the kindling took the little birch, and the flame stood up, small and orange and living, the one live color in all that dead gray shop, and she fed it the charcoal chip by careful chip until it settled and began to breathe of its own accord down in the black bed of the hearth. And she sat back on her heels on the cold stone floor with the firelight coming up under her browned and iron-stained face, and she watched the old black fire brick of the hearth back that had stood cold and dead a whole year take the light and warm, and begin, very faintly, along its lowest course where the heat gathered, to glow. That first fire burned itself out by midnight, and Judith let it, sitting on the oak stump beside the great anvil, until the last of the embers went from orange to ash gray, and the cold of the weald came creeping back in under the door. But she had learned what she needed to learn from it. The hearth had drawn. For all the year it had stood dead, for all the rain that had come down the crumbling chimney stack, and the swifts that had nested in the flue. The great stone forge still pulled its own smoke up and out into the dark. And that meant the throat of it was sound. And that meant a thing could be built here again. She had knelt and put her bare hand flat against the fire back, while the little blaze still lived, reading the warmth of the stone the way she read everything, and the stone had told her it was whole. In the morning she began, and she did not stop for a fortnight, but to eat and to sleep. And the work she began that gray March morning was not the work the parish thought of when it thought of a smith. There was no iron yet. There was no gate. Before a single bar could be drawn down there was the dead shop itself to be raised out of its own ruin, and Judith had been taught by the one man who ever mastered this hearth that the fire is only ever as good as the house you build around it, and that a careless smith who hurries past the tire and the bellows and the anvil to get his hands on the pretty iron, is a man who will spend the rest of his days wondering why nothing he makes comes true. So she went at the bones of it first. Old Elias Kemp came at first light, as he had come, she supposed, every morning of the empty year, out of grief and stubbornness and the plain want of anywhere else to put his hands, and when he found her already up to the elbow in the cold ash of the hearth, raking out a 12-month of soot and jackdaw sticks and the crumbled clay of her grandfather's last packing, the old man stood a moment in the door with his one clouded eye and his one good one, and said nothing, and then set down the crock he had brought and took up a rake and went at it beside her. They did not speak much. There was not the need. He knew where the good fire clay was to be dug from the bank behind the cottage, and she knew what it was for, and between the two of them the knowing went back and forth without words, which is its own kind of company. The two girls came up the lane at 7 with the frost still on the gorse. Judith had told them plainly the day she took them on that there was no wage in it yet, only their keep and what a body could learn, and that if they wanted honest indoor service in a warm house with a settled table they had best go elsewhere while they still could. And sturdy Tamsin, with her red cheeks and her brown curls escaping the faded kerchief, had only looked at her and said that every warm house from Mayfield to Wadhurst had already turned her from the door, and thin, watchful Bet behind her had said nothing at all, which Judith had come to understand was the girl's whole manner of agreeing. So they came, and she set them to work, and the work she set them was not sweeping. That was the first thing the village got wrong about Hartsfield. In the tale it told itself over its hedges that spring. It said the woman had taken on 2 farm brats to sweep and to carry, as anybody might, and that the real trade would want real men when it came to it. What the village did not see was that from the second morning Judith Ferrers was teaching those 2 girls the mystery itself, plainly and from the ground up, the way her grandfather had taught her at a height when she could not yet see over the edge of the Anvil. She showed them the tire first, the iron nozzle low in the fire back through which the whole life of the blast must pass, and how it had burned and pitted in her grandfather's last winters and must be packed round and round with wet fire clay worked in by the thumb until it sat true and tight. For a leaking tire, she told them, wastes half your wind up the chimney, and you will stand there all day, wondering why your iron will not come to heat. Bet, who had the quicker hands of the 2, took to the claying at once, working the gray stuff into the joint with a patience past her 15 years, and Judith let her do it and watched, and corrected her once, and after that did not need to correct her again. The great bellows was the long labor. It hung against the wall behind the hearth, the double-chambered leather lung of the whole shop, near as tall as a man, and the year of damp had done it no kindness. The leather had gone hard as a boot sole in places and cracked clean through in others, and the valve flaps inside had rotted to rag, so that when Tamsin first leaned her whole sturdy weight upon the top board, it wheezed and sighed and gave back scarcely a breath. They took it down between the 4 of them. They laid it out on the trestles, and Judith cut new leather from a hide the tanner at Mayfield let her have against a promise, and she showed the girls how the seams must be doubled and tallowed and stitched, with waxed thread drawn tight enough to whistle, and how the 2 flap valves within, the one that draws and the one that delivers, must sit soft and true and close of their own weight, or the whole engine is worthless. It was 3 days' work and more, and on the evening of the 3rd day, when they hung it back upon its pegs and coupled the tire, and Elias worked the great lever slow and easy, the bellows drew a long, clean breath, and let it out again into the dead hearth in one steady rush that lifted the fresh ash in a gray ghost off the fire back, and Tamsin laughed out loud at it. The sound of the thing, and even Bet's wary mouth moved at the corner. There remained the anvil. The great black anvil on its worn oak stump was the one thing in the shop the year had not been able to spoil. Being a ton of nothing but iron and steel and long-enduring. But its face had gone. 40 years of Abel Ferrers and his father before him had worn a soft hollow sway into the middle of it and battered the near edge into a row of little bruised nicks, and a hollow-faced anvil. Judith told the girls, "Will put its own crookedness into every straight thing you try to make upon it, so that you may hammer true all day and find your work curved as a sickle by dusk, and never understand the fault was under your hand the whole time and not in it." She dressed it herself, over 2 long evenings, with a coarse stone, and then a finer, and a straight edge laid across it, and held up against the light of the doorway again and again, grinding the sway out of the face till the straight edge showed no daylight beneath it anywhere along its length, and dressing the near edge back to a clean quarter round that would bend hot iron without cutting it. It was slow beyond the telling of it, and there is no glory in it, and the parish would not have counted it work at all. But when she had done, the black face of the anvil threw back the light of the door like still water, and she set the girls each in turn to lay a cold bar across it and strike it once with the hand hammer, and told them to listen. "Listen to the ring," she said. "A true anvil under a true blow gives you one clear note and no other, and it will hold that note under you all the days of your life. And when your ear knows that ring, you will hear at once when a thing goes wrong beneath your hammer, though your eye has not yet seen it." And Tamsin struck, and the anvil rang out one high, sweet singing note that hung in the cold shop and would not die. And the girl stood with the hammer arrested above her head and her mouth open at the sound of it. And Judith, watching, thought of her grandfather's broad, reddened hand closing over her own child's fist upon that same hammer 30 feet from where she now stood, and said nothing, and turned away to the fire so that the girls should not see her face. So the shop came back, bone by bone, out of the ruin. And it was in the 2nd week of it, with the hearth clayed and the bellows breathing and the anvil singing true, that the other thing began. For a rebuilt forge without iron to feed it is only a handsome grave. And iron, Judith was about to learn, was the exact place where her cousin had chosen to fight her. She had spoken, before ever she left Lewes, to the 2 journeyman smiths in the district who might have hired to her for the season, honest men both, one at Rotherfield and one over towards Frant, either of whom knew the trade well enough to have stood as her second at the fire, and both had given her fair words and a half promise. Now, within the fortnight, both sent word by boys that they were bespoke elsewhere and could not come. And the man from Frant would not meet her eye when she rode over to ask him plain, and looked instead at his boots and muttered that a man must think of his family and of who he might want work from in the years to come. And Judith understood him entirely, and did not press him, for it is no use pressing a frightened man, and less than no use shaming him, and she rode home knowing precisely whose money and whose soft warning had reached Frant before her. It was the same with the collier. Deep in the coppiced hangars above Hartsfield there lived and worked an old charcoal burner, a smoke-blackened solitary creature who tended his smoldering earths week on week through the season, and who had sold his charcoal to the Hartsfield forge for as long as anyone living could say. For the fine, bright work of the smith wants charcoal, and not the sea coal of the towns. Charcoal that burns clean and hot and leaves no taint of sulfur in the iron to make it rot under the hammer. Judith had gone up to him her first week and struck a bargain, and he had been glad of it, an old man glad of the old custom coming back. And then, within days, the smoke of his earth still standing plain against the sky above the wood, he stopped. He sent down no charcoal, and when she climbed up to him he was not to be found at his hut, and the next time she went the hut was shut, and the man gone off to work some other gentleman's wood a valley away. And a boy she met on the path told her, with the round eyes of a child repeating what he does not understand, that the old collier had been told the Hartsfield forge would not last the spring, and that there was no sense binding himself to a woman's whim that would leave him unpaid when the whole of it fell to Mr. Sowerby at Whitsun, as everyone knew it must. There it was again, the same soft hand, moving in the wood now as it had moved at Frant, closing her out of the very things a forge cannot live without, not with a blow anyone could point to and name, but with a word here and a shilling there, and a rumor let loose to do its patient work in the dark. Judith heard it all and said little. She had known from the reading of the will what manner of man her cousin was, and a man who will not strike you in the open, but works always at your supplies and your credit and your good name, is a man you cannot fight with anger, for anger is exactly the coin he means you to spend. She spent none. She banked it, the way she had learned to bank a fire she meant to keep alive through a long cold night, and she went on. But the third stroke came near to being the one that told, for it was aimed not at the men round her nor the fuel, but at the iron itself, at the very stuff of the trade, and it was cunning. A load of bar iron came up the lane on a carrier's cart one morning, a good load, ordered and paid for out of her thinning purse from a factor at Lewes whose name her grandfather had dealt with honestly for 20 years. And the carrier tipped it in the yard with a great clangour of bars, and Judith went out to it glad, for here at last was the beginning of the true work, and she knew before she had handled 3 bars of it that something was wrong. It looked well enough. It was the right scantling and the right weight, and it bore the right factor's chalk mark on the ends. But Abel Ferrers had spent 10 years teaching a grave-eyed girl to read iron with her hands and her eye and her ear before he would let her put a hammer to it, and the lesson had gone into the bone, and this iron, when she lifted a bar and flexed it and rang it against the anvil, gave back a note that was wrong, a short dead note with no true iron song in it, and showed at the sawn end a grain that glittered a shade too bright, a coarse crystalline sparkle where good tough wrought iron should show a soft gray silky fibre like the grain of a split stick. Cold short. The word came up in her the moment she saw it, in her grandfather's very voice. Cold short iron, iron gone brittle and false, that will handle sweet enough while it is red in the fire and then crack and fly to pieces cold under the least strain. Iron that no honest factor would knowingly sell and no honest smith would knowingly buy. Iron fit for cart tire and gate hinge if a man were dishonest enough, and fit for nothing at all for the fine-drawn scrollwork of a church gate that must bear its own weight and swing true for 100 years. Someone had got at the load between the factor's yard and her own. Someone had swapped good bar for bad, or leaned on the factor to send her his worst stock knowing she would be blamed, and not he when the work failed under her hands. And here was the deep cunning of it, the thing that near stopped her heart in the yard that morning. Had she been the fool the parish took her for, she would have taken this iron into the fire in good faith and drawn it down and welded it and built her gates of it leaf by leaf through all the long labor of the spring. And it would have looked well, and it would have held together through the hanging and the consecration and the first admiring week of it, and then some frost-hard morning a scroll would have snapped clean across of its own cold brittleness, and the whole great gate come down in the churchyard mud, and every soul in the Weald would have said, "There, we told you. No woman can make iron," and her cousin would have had his estate and his proof both at a single blow struck 3 months before by a hand nobody could name. It was the cleverest thing that was done against her in the whole of that spring, and it failed for the one reason all his cleverness failed in the end, that he had never once, in all his soft calculation, allowed for the plain fact that the woman could actually read the iron. She called the two girls out to the yard. She would not have them go on in doubt of her, and she would not have them learn this from anyone but her. And there was besides a thing here they must carry all their lives if they were ever to be smiths. She set a bar of the bad iron in the hardy, and she took the sledge herself, and she said, "Watch the break. Watch how it goes." And she struck it cold, one hard true blow. And the bar did not bend as good iron bends, grudging and slow with a burr and a curl. It snapped clean across at a single stroke like a stick of barley sugar, and lay in two bright fractured pieces in the mud. She picked up the two ends and held them out, one in each iron-stained hand, to Tamsin and to Bet, and made them look close at the broken faces, at the coarse, glittering grain that caught the light like frost. And she told them, "That is a lie in the shape of a bar of iron. Good iron will not do that. Good iron loves you. It will bend a long way before it breaks, and warn you the whole way. And when it does break at last, it tears like living wood, and the grain of the break is gray and silky and long. This is dead stuff, poured false or spoiled a purpose, and it would have broken just so, cold some winter morning, under a child leaning on our gate. We will not use it, not one bar." And she had the whole load carried back out to the yard edge and stacked apart under the gorse, where no tired hand could reach for it by mistake in the dark. And there it lay, the cousin's cleverest stroke, a monument to what he thought a woman could not see, and the sending of it back, and the writing of the letter to the lose factor that told him plainly what he had let leave his yard, and that Hartsfield would deal elsewhere hereafter, cost her 3 days and a good part of her small remaining money, and left her at the week's end with a living forge and a singing anvil and breathing bellows, and not one honest ounce of iron in all the shop to feed them. It was at that low place that the captain came. He came as he did, on the big, quiet, iron-gray horse, up the lane out of the drizzle of a Thursday afternoon, and he did not come with questions, and he did not come with his hat in his hand, and that soft, dreadful pity in his face that she had learned to dread more than any open scorn. Captain Nathaniel Reeve had buried a wife, and left an arm's use of a leg on some foreign field, and had learned, in whatever hard school those things teach, the one manner Judith could bear to be helped in, which is the manner of one solitary competent creature acknowledging another across a stretch of bad ground, with no debt named and no rescue implied. He had heard, he said, sitting his horse in the yard, that she was short of iron. He did not say how he had heard, and she did not ask, and she did not trouble either of them with the tale of the cold short load, and she saw by something that crossed his careworn face that he knew it already, and thought the more of her for not parading it. He knew a man, he said, below the downs towards Luce, an old artillery contractor's man who had good tough Sussex bar of the right sort, worked charcoal iron, honest stuff, and who owed the captain an old turn and would sell fair and ask no questions of who the smith was, nor whether she wore breeches or a gown. And there was besides, he said, a collier over his own side of the hill who would burn her a load and be glad of the custom, and was too far off and too plain-minded to be reached by any word out of Hartsfield's parish. He would send his own cart. He would send it Monday. And that, said the captain, was the end of that, in the tone of a man closing a matter he did not care to have thanked for. And Judith, who had steeled herself to refuse charity and found she had been offered none, thanked him not at all, because he plainly did not want it, and instead asked him in out of the wet. They sat by the reviving fire, the two of them, while the girls clattered at some work in the far end of the shop, and old Elias mended a rake tine at the vise and pretended to hear nothing. And they did not speak of Gates, nor of Sowerby, nor of the will, nor of anything that could be called the business of the day. He asked her how her grandfather had come by the sway in the old Anvil, and she told him 40 years of it, and he nodded as a man nods who understands what 40 years of anything does to a thing, and looked into the fire. She found she could sit with him and not fill the silence, which was a thing she could do with almost no living person, and he the same, and the understanding that grew up between them in that half hour by the glow of the hearth was not the kind that hurries towards anything, nor asks anything, nor needs to be spoken of to be true, but was only two grave people who had each been thoroughly beaten by the world, and had each declined to lie down under it, recognizing the like in the other and being quietly glad. When he rose to go, the light had gone amber outside, and the fire had painted the whole low room the color of a banked coal. And he stood a moment in the door with his old saber-scarred face lit up one side by the glow, and said only that she was doing a right thing and doing it right, which from him she understood to be a great deal, and rode off into the dusk. And she needed the whole of that small warmth, for the parish gave her none. Word had gone round, as word does, and word had been helped along the road by the cousin's shilling, and within the week there came up the lane a stiff and unhappy deputation of two, a churchwarden and a member of the rebuilding committee, good enough men in their way but frightened men, who stood in her yard turning their hats and would not come in, and told her, not looking at her, that the committee had met, and that there was concern, great concern, whether the gates could truly be got done and hung and true by Whitson by A. Here the churchwarden's courage failed him, and he changed his word in his mouth by so small a shop, and that Mr. Sowerby had very handsomely let it be known that his own works stood ready to take up the commission and see it finished in good time, and no blame to anyone if the change were made, and that the committee wished her to understand they had not decided, that they wished her well, but that the church must have its gates, and the parish must not be made a laughing-stock, and the time was very short. Judith heard them out to the end without a word, which unsettled them more than any protest could have, and then she said only this, that the commission was her grandfather's, given to him in writing and paid on in part, and hers now by his will, that she would forfeit it to no man living 1 hour before Whitson, and that if the committee would do her the one justice of holding to their bargain until the day named in it, they would find the gates hung true in their stone piers before the bell rang for the consecration, and might give the whole of it to her cousin with her blessing if they were not. She did not raise her voice. She did not plead. And the two frightened men went away not much comforted but a little ashamed, which was as much as she could hope for, and more than her cousin had reckoned she could get. Then she shut the door on the pale wet evening and turned back to the one place in all the world where the argument could be truly answered, which was the fire. For the captain's iron had come up on the Monday as he said it would, a great honest stack of it gray and tough and true, and his charcoal after it, and she had handled every bar of it and wrung it, and read its long silky grain and known it for the real thing at last. And now, with the shop dark but for the one live glow, and the girls gathered close and old Elias at the great lever of the bellows, she would find out whether a year of ruin and a spring of malice had left her the one thing that could not be bought, nor stolen, nor frightened away, which was the trick of her own 2 hands. She chose 2 bars of the good iron, and cut and scarfed the ends of them, laying each to a long clean feather edge, and she brought them into the fire together, and told Elias to give her his wind slow and even. and she watched them take the heat. Red first, dull and then deepening to cherry, and up through cherry to a bright rising orange, and she stood over them without moving and read the color climbing in the iron the way she had once read the pewter light on a rain-streaked window in a loose attorney's room, with her whole grave attention and nothing held back, up past orange into yellow, the two scarfed ends soaking the heat clean through to their hearts. And she dusted them with a handful of clean silver sand for a flux, and let them go on, up and up, past yellow now into a fierce rising white, until the surface of the iron began to shimmer and run wet and molten-looking, and to throw off the first bright darting stars, little threads of white fire leaping off the metal into the dark of the shop. And Tamsin drew in her breath sharp, and Bet's pale face was all gold in the light of it. And at the very moment the iron sweated and starred and swam at that welding heat, and not one instant after, Judith swung both bars from the fire in a single motion, laid the two blazing scarfs one exactly upon the other across the true face of the singing anvil, and struck. The hammer came down clean and square, and the white iron gave under it with a soft, heavy shove and a burst of sparks that flew the length of the shop, and she struck again on the heel of the first blow before the light had died, and again, working from the center out the way her grandfather's hand had worked from the center out, driving the two white-hot faces into one another, welding the very grain of the one into the grain of the other so that where there had been two bars there was now one, made whole under her hand in the heat, with no seam a knife could find nor frost could ever prise apart. She turned it and dressed it and struck it true, and quenched it, and when the steam had cleared she held the welded bar up to the door light and bent it hard across her knee, and it did not open at the weld, and it did not so much as show where the weld had been. It was one bar, sound and whole and hers, and the shop rang. It rang with the true high-singing note of good iron worked hot on a true anvil by a hand that knew the whole mystery of it. One clear note after another going out through the open door and away into the dusk over the bracken and the gorse. The first such sound to come off Hartsfield Hill in a year and more. And old Elias let go the bellows lever and stood with his one good eye running frankly over. And the two farm girls that the whole county had turned from its doors looked at the woman and at the fire and at the hole and gleaming iron in her hand, and understood, before ever a leaf of the great gates was drawn, that the thing the guild had laughed at was going to be done. A weld drawn clean is one thing, and a country full of iron another, and Judith Ferrars understood in the ringing quiet after that first true joint that she had proved only the least of what she would be asked to prove. The forge lived again, the hearth glowed, the anvil rang under her hand as it had rung under Abel's, and all of that, set beside the thing the gates required of her, was no more than a candle carried into a cathedral. For the gates were not to be plain bar iron scrolled and riveted, such as any journeyman might beat out on a wet afternoon. They were to be watered. That single word had gone about the parish for 40 years as a kind of countryside legend, the way men will speak of a thing they have seen with their own eyes and yet do not believe, that old Abel Ferrars could lay a scroll of iron across the light and the metal would answer with a rippling silver grain running through it like moonlight lying on a slow river, a pattern no acid could scrub away, because it was not painted on, but forged in, down through the whole body of the steel. The gentry had commissioned the church gates on the strength of that watered sheen and nothing else. Take the water out of them, and they were a smith's gates, worth a smith's price. Leave it in, and they were a wonder, worth the name of a dead man and the freehold of Hartsfield, and the confounding of every voice that had laughed in the attorney's cold chambers. And the method of it, the how, the exact and jealous how, Abel had carried down into the churchyard mold with him, save for the one place it survived, which was the locked oak chest, and the cipher, and the granddaughter he had taught to read it when she was 7 years old and small enough to sit on the anvil stump with her boots swinging. You will forgive an old teller for lingering here, at the heart of the thing, for this is the part of the tale the neighbors never saw and never would have credited. Not the gates hung, not the cousin undone, but the long solitary nights in which a young woman by one guttering candle taught herself a mystery the guild had sworn no woman could hold. She began it the very evening the fresh iron came home. When the girls were gone to their pallet in the cottage loft and old Elias had banked the fire and limped away to his cot behind the fuel store, Judith drew the oak chest to the hearthside, turned the wards of the lock with the key that had hung at her own throat since the burying, and lifted out the pattern book. It was no book as a lady keeps a book. It was a fat bundle of loose leaves, some vellum, most coarse gray paper, gone soft as cloth at the folds, bound between two boards with a thong, and every leaf was covered edge to edge in Abel's cramped brown hand, but not in words a stranger could read. He had written the recipes of his craft in a cipher of his own devising. A running private shorthand of letters stood for other letters, of little drawn signs that meant heats and hammers and folds, of numbers that were sometimes numbers and sometimes the count of blows, and sometimes, she had learned as a child, nothing at all but blinds set there to baffle a thief. Sowerby, she thought, with the ghost of something that was not quite a smile, might steal the whole chest and sit over it till Michaelmas and read out of it no more than he could read out of the rooks in the elms. It was written for one pair of eyes, and by a long, slow patience those eyes had been made hers. She found the watered steel leaves near the middle, marked with the little sign of a wavy line that she remembered tracing with her fingertip while he watched, and she bent to them. Understand what she was truly doing. In those hours, she was not reading a receipt as a cook reads one, a spoonful of this and a pinch of that. She was recovering a conversation. Every crabbed line was Abel speaking to a version of himself who would come after and need reminding, and the granddaughter had to stand in for that self, to guess at his shorthand mind, to know that where he had written the sign for oatmeal, he did not mean oatmeal, but the pale gray color a certain heat throws. Because 40 years ago at this hearth he had said to her, "That is your porridge heat. Girl, no hotter, or the water runs out of it." She read till the candle was a stub and her eyes swam, and what she carried up to her bed at last was not the whole method but the shape of it, the bones of it, that the watering was got by welding. Not one iron but two, or three, or a stack of many, bars of hard steel and bars of soft iron laid one upon another like the leaves of a book, brought to a white welding heat altogether, hammered down into one solid billet, then drawn out long and doubled back on itself and welded again, and again, and again, the two metals folding through one another, fold upon fold until a single bar held within it hundreds of hair-fine layers. And it was those layers, cut across and filed smooth and washed with a weak acid, that stood up out of the finished surface as the rippling silver grain. That much the book gave her plainly. What it could not give her, what no book on earth can give, was the hand. She learned that at a cost, and I will not pretend to you that she learned it cheap. Her first billet she built proudly and lost wholly. She stacked her bars fair and true, bound them with wire, brought them up in the fire, while Tamsin worked the great bellows in long, even strokes as she had been taught. And at what Judith judged the welding heat she snatched the stack to the anvil and struck, and the layers did not marry. They lay against one another and would not become one. A scale of gray ash had crept between them in the fire and held them apart the way a sheet of paper will hold 2 boards from gluing. And when she drew the billet out, it came apart along its length, in a fan of loose leaves, delaminated, ruined. A morning's fuel and a morning's iron gone to nothing on the shop floor. Bet, watching from the file bench with her wary pale eyes, said not a word, but Judith saw the girl's small flinch, saw the doubt settle back into that thin, watchful face, and knew the child was thinking what half the parish thought, that the thing could not be done, least of all by them. Judith swept the spoiled iron aside with her boot and said only, "Too much scale. We starve the fire of air at the joining and flux it clean, and we go again." The second billet burned. She held it in the fire a breath too long, reaching for a heat hotter than the first failure, and steel at the very edge of welding is a hair's breadth from steel destroyed. She drew it out, throwing white sparks like a handful of flung stars, beautiful and fatal. The carbon burning out of it in that fountain of light, and what reached the anvil was a bar gone, rotten and crumbling at the surface, spitting, gone. The third would not draw down true. The fourth watered, but watered false. A coarse, muddy grain with no silver in it. Layers too few and too thick. The pattern of a country blacksmith's guessing, and not of Abel Ferrers's art. And here is the thing I would have you carry away from this part of the tale. You who are perhaps sitting through some cold, hard patch of your own and wondering whether the world was right about you after all, she did not despair, and she did not rage, and she did not once, in all those spoiled mornings, entertain the thought of quitting the field to Gideon Sowerby. She kept a tally on the whitewashed wall by the hearth, in charcoal. She set down every billet, and against it in her cramped hand what had gone wrong, and what she judged the cause. Porridge heat too high, flux too dry, folds uneven, cooled too fast, building out of her own failures the very leaf of the pattern book Abel had never lived to write, because he had never needed to, because for him the hand had come so long ago he had forgotten it was ever learned. She was learning it in weeks what he had taken years to own, and she was learning it alone. And by the guttering middle of the third week, the charcoal tally on the wall ran to more than 30 billets, and every one of them a failure, and every one of them a lesson she had wrung out by the neck. Old Elias watched. He said little. He was a man of perhaps 4 words to the hour, and one clouded milk-white eye, and forearms like ship's cable knotted onto the frame of a whip. But he had struck for Abel 40 years, and there was nothing about the welding heat his one good eye did not know. And Judith learned to read his silences as she read the iron. When she brought a stack up too fast, he would draw a slow breath through his teeth, and she learned to wait. When the fire sat wrong in the hearth, banked hollow or heaped dead, he would take the slice out of her hand without a word and open the heart of it and give it back. And she learned the shape a welding fire must hold, a clean deep hollow of white-hot coke with no green smoke in it and no cold spot, a little cave of pure heat into which the iron went to be married. And on the night it came, right at last, you have been waiting for that night, and so had she for something above a month. It came so quietly she almost did not trust it. It was late, near midnight, the girls asleep, Elias gone to his cot, and she had told herself only one more heat before she let the fire down. She had fluxed the stack with a scatter of clean silver sand and river borax, as the book directed, worked the bellows herself in the dark shop till the hollow of the fire ran that pure and steady white that has no color left in it at all, and brought the billet up, slow, watching for the instant the surface went wet-looking and began to throw the first faint sweating sparks that are the true sign, not the fountain of the burning, but a few lazy swimming stars that say now, this instant, not sooner, and not one breath later. And on that instant she drew it and set it and struck, light and quick down its whole length, tacking the leaves together before the heat could flee. Then back to the fire and up again, and this time the great blows. And she felt it under the hammer, felt the stack cease to be a stack and become a bar, felt the sullen dead ring of unwelded iron turn to the clean live song of one solid metal answering the anvil as a bell answers the clapper. She drew it out long. She doubled it and welded it home and drew it again, 7 times, 8, the layers multiplying past all counting, and near 2 in the morning she cut a coupon from the end of it, ground the cut face bright on the stone, and washed it with the weak acid in a saucer by the candle. And the grain rose. Out of the plain gray iron, as the acid bit, there swam up slow a rippling watered pattern, fine as combed silk, silver on smoke, 100 hair fine layers curling and folding through one another like current over a gravel bed. Catching the candle flame and throwing it back changed, moonlight, the parish had called it, and moonlight it was, cold and running and alive in the dead metal, and no other hand in the whole county of Sussex could have raised it. Judith Ferrers sat down on the anvil stump with the little bright coupon in her scarred palm, and she did not weep, though I think a lesser telling would have her weep. She sat and turned it to the candle and watched the water run in it, and after a while she said aloud to the sooty rafters, in a voice gone rough with tiredness, "There you are then," as though greeting at long last a friend who had been very ill and was mending. She had the water. Now she had the gates to build, and building them was another labor and a longer, for the watered steel was only the skin and glory of the scrollwork. The great gates themselves were a forest of forged iron, 2 tall leaves, each near the height of 2 men, every upright and rail and scroll to be drawn and bent and fire, welded and fitted, the whole of it grown up leaf by leaf out of the hearth the way a real oak grows, ring on ring, and slower. She forged the oak leaves first, and she found her method in the forging of them. An oak leaf in iron is not a thing you buy the trick of in an afternoon. You draw a tongue of the watered bar down thin as a knife, then upset and spread it under the hammer into the broad lobed shape. Then take the little chisels and veining tools and cut into the red metal the ribs and the deep notched margin, so that the finished leaf lies in the hand with the patterned silver running down its every vein, and the edges curling as a true leaf curls in the wind. Her first was clumsy and thick, and she flung it in the scrap. Her 10th was fair. Her 50th she could beat out clean in a heat and a half, with the girls striking to her tongs. And this is where I would have you see Tamsin and Bet, because the tale of the gates is quietly also the tale of those 2 turned away farm girls, and I have not forgotten them. They had come to Hartsfield to sweep. They stayed to strike. Tamsin, the ruddy, sturdy one with her broad, capable hands, took to the sledge and the striking as though she had been kept from it all her 16 years, and only now let loose. And within a month she could stand across the anvil from her mistress and land the great blows true where they were pointed, blow answering tap, the 2 of them beating a scroll round without a word passing because none was needed, the hammer language settling between them the way it settles between all true strikers. Thin, pale Bet was no sledger. She had not the frame for it, but she had a still exactness in her that Judith prized above muscle. She took the files and the finishing tools and the slow acid washing of the watered work, and she would sit over a single leaf for an hour making the silver grain come up even and true. Her wary, quiet mouth pursed in concentration, and she learned to keep the great bellows too, to read the fire's color and feed it air in the long, even strokes that hold a welding heat, and there grew, in that thin, watchful face, week upon week, something Judith watched with a private gladness. the thing that grows in any young creature that discovers, against all it has been told, that its hands are worth something. They were becoming smiths. 3 women and a half-blind old man in a soot-black shop on the edge of the heath, forging a wonder the guild had sworn a woman could not touch. And the parish, when word of the ringing anvil crept down the lanes, did not know whether to marvel or to mutter, and mostly, being a parish, it muttered. Gideon Sowerby saw to that. He had watched his cousin's cold forge come alive with the cold pale eyes of a man watching a debt he thought settled walk back in at the door. And where honeyed offers and warned-off charcoal burners and cold short iron had not turned her, he let his hand grow heavier and quieter both. Tools began to walk. A set of the veining chisels Judith had ground true went missing from the bench between a Saturday night and a Monday morning, and no lock had been forced, and she looked at the smooth pale face of the parish and could prove nothing. Her best pair of tongs turned up a week after in the horse pond, red with rust past saving. These were pinpricks, and she bore them as pinpricks, but the fire in the fuel store was not a pinprick, and I will tell it to you plainly because she felt it plainly. It was a black night near the end of a long week, the rain holding off, a dry wind coming off the heath, and Judith woke in the cottage past midnight to a light on the ceiling that had no business there, a low restless orange flicker, where only the dark should be. And she was down the stair and out into the yard in her shift, with her heart going like the bellows before she had rightly waked. The fuel store, the long lean to where a whole spring's charcoal lay banked and dry, her fire, her heats, her weeks of forging all reckoned in those black baskets. The fuel store was a light at the near end, a mean, creeping, crawling fire that had been set low against the timber wall where the wind would take it, and had she waked a half-hour later, there would have been no waking it out at all. She screamed the girls up, and she got Elias. The old man came out of his cot behind the store faster than his years, and it was he who had the sense of it, who had the water butt tipped, and the wet sacks, and the long slice to rake the burning baskets out into the bare yard where they could burn themselves dead on the mud. And the 4 of them fought it in the dark with their hands, and the butt and the pond water hauled in leather buckets, coughing, scorched, till the wind had nothing left to take, and the fire sank down into a hissing, steaming ruin of black. They saved the store. They did not save the charcoal at the near end, a week's worth of it, more. The greater part of what she had left, gone to wet cinder and stink, and they did not save the sleep, and they did not save the thing that fire is truly set to burn, which is not the fuel but the spirit of the one it is set against. Judith stood in the smoking dark in her ruined shift with her hands blistered and her face black, and looked at the low, deliberate scar of the burning against the timber, low into the windward as no accident of a banked cot fire ever lay, and she knew, as surely as she knew a false weld under the hammer, that a hand had set it, and whose, and that she could no more prove that than she could prove the tongs into the pond. And the parish, when the smoke was smelt down the valley next morning, did not say a hand had set it. The parish, worked on for weeks by a soft-voiced ironmaster who turned his fob seals in his fingers and shook his sandy head and wondered aloud whether it was wholesome for a young woman alone to be firing a great forge through the night, said that it was a judgment, or a carelessness, or a warning, that the works were unlucky, that no good would come of a woman meddling in the mystery of iron, that she would burn herself and the whole hillside in her ruin, and had they not all said as much in the beginning? That is how it is done. The quiet ruin of a name, not with a blow, but with a shaking head. It was Captain Reeve who came up the lane that morning through the reek, on his big gray horse, and swung down stiff-legged in the yard without a word of the pity she could not have borne, and looked a long while at the low scar of the burning where she looked, and said at last, in his grave, careworn voice, "That was said. Only that." And Judith Ferrers, who had not let one tear fall through 30 spoiled billets, nor through the honeyed threats, nor through the fire itself, found her throat close at those two plain words, not at kindness. For kindness she could have refused, but at being, for once, simply believed, one competent solitary soul by another, with no coin of pity asked or paid in it. He did not offer to set a watch as one offers a lady a favor. He said he would sleep the next fortnight in the cart shed with his old service pistol and his dog, if she had no objection, until the second gate was hung, because a man who had stood a battery through a night bombardment did not greatly mind a fortnight's short sleeping, and it would vex him to see good iron burned for want of a wakeful eye. She had the wit and the grace not to refuse him. So there grew between those two, over the last hard stretch of the forging, a thing I would not insult by calling a courtship, for not a word of the kind passed, and I think both of them would have colored to hear it named. It grew in the labor. He was no smith and did not pretend to be, but he was an artilleryman, and an artilleryman is a man who has spent his life moving vast dead weights of iron by rope and lever and cool arithmetic, and there is no better hand on earth to have by you when a gate leaf the height of 2 men and heavy as a felled tree must be turned over on the shop floor without a bent scroll, or hoisted upright, or rigged to the anvil beam for the fitting of the top rail. He rigged her hoists. He spliced her a strong tackle out of his own gun tackle stores. He would stand at the far end of a glowing 7-foot bar with the tongs while she welded the near, matching her without being told, the way Elias matched her, the way Tamsin matched her at the sledge. And Judith came to know the particular grave sound of his slight stiff step in the yard at dusk as a thing the day had been leaning toward without her marking it. They spoke of the work. Now and then, over the reviving fire when the girls were abed, they spoke a little past the work, he of a dead wife and a still house, and the flat grayness of a soldier's peace with no war and no purpose left in it, she of a grandfather's hands and a cipher book, and the strange lightness she felt, God forgive her, working herself to the bone in a trade the world forbade her, more herself at this scorched anvil than she had ever been in any parlor she was meant for. That was all. It was a great deal. And meanwhile, night by night, the gate grew. She built the first leaf entire before ever she began the second, so that she might have the whole of one true thing standing to measure the other against, the 2 great uprights fire welded and the rails between them, and then the long labor of the scrolls, the watered oak leaves, and the acorns fitted into the ironwork one by one, riveted and collared and fire brazed home. The patterned silver running now through the whole climbing forest of it, so that the leaf, when a rag was passed over it and the acid washed on, threw back the hearth light in 100 running silver ripples along every curl and vein. It took the last of the recovered charcoal and the last of her strength, and it was finished. The first great gate leaf finished whole, on a raw night in the week before Whitsun, near 2 in the morning, as her true labors always seemed to reach their crown. They stood it upright in the wide shop doorway to let it cool and to see it, at last, as it would be seen, on its full height against the dark, and Judith stepped back into the yard with the girls to look, and Reeve came from the cart shed, and old Elias last of all, wiping his one good eye. It stood the height of 2 men and more in the doorway of that soot-black shop, a great climbing panel of forged oak grown out of iron, leaf over acorn over scroll, and where the low hearth light behind it, and the pale rag of a moon before it fell across the watered steel the whole leaf woke and ran with cold silver, moonlight lying and moving on the black metal exactly as the parish legend had sworn old Abel's iron could be made to move, done and by her hand and by no other. Nobody spoke for a long moment, and then old Elias Kemp, who had struck iron at that hearth for 40 years, and had seen, in his time, everything a Wilden forge can make and had a word for none of it, took one limping step toward the gleaming leaf and stopped, and stood looking up at the silver running in the dark iron with his one clouded eye and his one good one, and took off his battered cap, slow, the way a man does in a church, and that from Elias was worth more than all the applause of the county, and Judith knew it, and stood in the cold yard with her burned hands hanging and her grandfather's water running silver in her finished gate, and let it be. For that one night, enough, there is a kind of week that comes to every long labor when the end of it stands at last in plain sight, and the sight is more terrible than any part of the darkness behind. For hope has a weight to it that despair never carries, and a body may bear despair a great while, but hope will wear the marrow out of the bones. Such a week came now to Hartsfield. The first gate leaf stood finished against the smithy wall, where old Elias had left off staring at it, and the second was 3 parts made, its great outer frame drawn and mitred and welded true, its lower scrolls turned, the oak leaves that were to fill its middle panels lying in their rows on the bench like the leaves of some iron autumn waiting to be gathered up and set. 12 days remained until Whitsun. 12 days, and after them the reconsecration of Hartsfield Church, and the piers of grey stone before its door standing empty or standing hung, and the whole of her grandfather's name and her own life turning upon which it should be. Judith counted the days the way she counted heats, without haste and without any easing of her face, and she gave no one the counting to see. But she had begun to sleep 4 hours of the night and no more, and the fine old burn scar along her forearm stood out paler than it had, the way a scar will on a body that is being run too hard. Tamsin marked it and said nothing, and carried a second dish of oatmeal to the smithy of a morning without being bid. Bet marked it, and grew quieter than her quiet, and watched the lane. And it was well the 2 girls watched, for the 12 days were the days in which Gideon Sowerby, who had made his war in whispers and warned off charcoal burners and cold short iron all the long months of the winter, came at last openly into the light and made it in the manner of men who are certain of their ground. The first sign of it was a letter, brought out from Lewes by a hired boy who would not come near the forge door, but stood off in the lane and held it out at arm's length as though the place were plaguey. It was from an attorney, though not from old Mr. Raysbury who had read the will, but from another house, a sharper house, and it was full of the long, soft words that lawyers use to say a hard thing gently. It gave her to know that her cousin Mr. Sowerby had laid before the parish committee, and before the magistrate himself, Sir Harry Ancliffe of Coombe, a representation touching the church gates. That grave doubt was now raised whether the commission for the said gates had ever in truth been the sole work of the late Abel Ferrers, that it was credibly given out that the old man, feeling his strength go from him in his last winter and doubting his own hand, had of his own will made over the finishing of the work to a master smith in Mr. Sowerby's employ, one Josiah Pell of Uckfield, and that the gates now in progress at Hartsfield were therefore made under a false colour of right and could not lawfully be hung. She read it twice through at the smithy door, with the wind pulling at the paper, and then she folded it along its creases and put it inside her apron bib against her heart, not because she held it dear, but because she would have it by her. And she went back in and took up the hammer, and the ring of the anvil that afternoon was the only answer she made to it. But the letter was the least of it. A letter is a thing a body may hold in the hand and read the malice of. What Sowerby had loosed into the county along with it could not be held in any hand, for it went from mouth to mouth over the ale pots at the Chequers and across the pews after service and along the field paths where the women carried their dinner pails, and it changed its shape at every telling as such things will, and it needed no proof because it asked for none, that the gates were never truly old Abel's, that the girl at Hartsfield was finishing another man's work and calling it her grandfather's, that Josiah Pell had the drawings by him yet and could show them, that it was a scandal and a cheat, and that gentlefolk who had at first been minded to admire the thing were now shaking their heads over it and saying it was a pity, a great pity. But there it was. Judith heard the shape of it come back to her in 100 small ways in those days. In the set of a farmer's shoulders who had used to give her good morning, and now found the far hedge worth his study. In the way the carrier set down her bar iron and took his money and would not meet her eye. In a word let fall by the vicar's own wife, who came out to Hartsfield meaning kindness, and stayed to leave a doubt behind her like a drought under a door. It is a cruel thing to watch a lie do its work, the narrator would tell you, for a lie asks nothing of a man but that he do nothing, and doing nothing is the easiest labor in the world. And I will not pretend to you, sitting here by the fire, that it did not bite her, for it bit her to the bone. But mark this, and keep it by you against your own bad weeks. She did not once take up the lie to argue with it. She had no proof to set against Sowerby's whisper that would answer it in kind, no witness living who had stood at the old man's elbow, no paper from Abel's own hand that named the work as his, and no others, for the pattern book was in cipher, and would speak to no one but her. And a cipher proves nothing to a magistrate. What she had was the iron. What she had was the thing itself, growing under her hands in the black shop day by day, and she had come already, in the long silence of her own thinking over the anvil, to a resolution about it that she told to no one, not to Elias, not to the captain, not to the girls, and it was this resolution, and not the letter and not the whispering, that carried her through what came next. For Sowerby, having moved openly with the law and openly with the lie, moved now a third time, and the third move was in the dark, and it was the worst thing he did in all that bad business, for it very nearly killed a child. It fell out upon the 9th evening before Whitsun. They had been rigging the second finished leaf, for the second was finished now, or all but, wanting only its overthrow and the last dressing of its scrolls, and to set a gate leaf upright a body must sling it, for the thing is a tall man's height and more of wrought iron, and weighs what 3 men weigh, and it cannot be man-handled but must be lifted by a chain hoist rigged to the great oak tie beam that ran the length of the smithy roof. Abel had hung that hoist himself 40 years gone, and it had lifted every heavy thing the shop had made since. And its chain was good chain, and its hook was a hook Abel had forged, and Judith had gone over the whole of it with her own eye and her own hand not a week before, as her grandfather had taught her to go over any gear that would carry weight above a person's head. But some hand had been at it since. Some hand had come in the dark of one of those short nights when even Judith slept her 4 hours, and had drawn the pin that closed the great hook and set it back only to the look of the thing, so that it held while the leaf hung still and would slip its load the moment the load swung. This the narrator knows, and you shall know it. Though Judith did not know it yet that evening, she knew only that Tamson had the guy rope and Bet was in under the swinging leaf steadying its foot to bring it to the wall, little Bet with her straw fair plaits and her wary eyes, in close under 300 weight of iron, where she had been 100 times before in perfect safety, and that between one breath and the next there was a sound from the roof beam that was no sound the shop had ever made, a wrong dead clink, and the great leaf lurched and came away from the hook and swung down loose and murdering upon the child. What saved Bet was three things, and not one of them was chance, though the world would call them chance. The first was that Elias Kemp, half-blind old Elias, had lived his whole life under hung iron and had the ear for a wrong sound bred into him below thought, and he bawled out a single word before ever his mind had reasoned upon it. The second was that Judith, at the bellows end, had never in all those months let herself forget for one heat that a forge is a place that kills the careless, and she was already moving at the sound of Elias's voice, moving before she knew why, with the long hafted setting bar in her two hands. And the third was Bet herself, that thin, watchful girl who watched the lane, for she had watched the leaf too, distrusting it as she distrusted everything Sowerby's malice had taught her to distrust. And she did not freeze as a trusting child freezes, but flung herself back and down against the anvil stump. And the great iron leaf came down where she had stood, and its lower corner drove into the earth floor a hand's breadth from her ankle and stood quivering. And Judith's setting bar took its swing and turned it off the wall, so that it fell flat and did not fall upon the girl. Then there was a silence in the black shop with the one live glow of the fire in it, and in that silence Bet began to cry, not loudly. The way a child cries that has learned crying does no good. And Tamsin was down on her knees in the dirt with her arms about her. And old Elias stood with his clouded eye and his good one both fixed on the fallen leaf and his knotted hands shaking. And Judith set down the bar and went and knelt by the two girls and put her iron-stained hand on Bet's straw-fair head and said only, "You are not hurt. You did rightly. You are not hurt." And when she had said it enough times that the child believed it, she got up and went to the roof beam and looked at the hook, and read in it in one glance the drawn pin and the set-back look of a thing made to fail. And her face when she turned from it was a face I would not have wished Gideon Sowerby to see, for it had gone past anger into something colder and more lasting, into the place where a resolution that was already made grows roots that no man will ever after tear up. That was the 9th night. The ruin of it was not only the fright and the near murder of a child, though God knows that was ruin enough. It was that the second leaf, coming down as it came, had cracked. Not through. The wrought frame held, iron will bend and gape before it breaks clean. But along the weld of the lower scroll where the watered steel ran, one of the pattern welded scrolls that were the whole glory and the whole proof of the work, there had opened a fault, a lipped gray seam a finger long, and a gate hung before a church to stand 100 years cannot go up with a sprung weld in it that will weep rust and gape wider every winter until it fails. It would have to be cut out and drawn down and welded whole and the pattern raised again true, and there were 8 days now to Whitsun, and the overthrow yet to make, and the whole of the leadwork of both leaves yet to set. A lesser heart, or a wiser one by the world's reckoning, would have sent that night to Uckfield or to Lewes for a journeyman's hands to share the load, for it was more than one worn woman and an old man and 2 frightened girls could carry in 8 days, and every soul in the county would have owned it more than they could carry. Captain Reeve owned it. He had come over on his big iron-gray horse the next morning, having heard for such news runs, and he stood in the smithy in his shabby dark blue coat with his careworn face and his old saber scar, and looked at the cracked leaf a long while, and then he looked at Judith, who had not slept at all, whose dark auburn hair had come half down out of its knot, and who had a burn on her thumb she had not troubled to bind, and he said, in the plain voice of a man who chooses his words as he would choose his ground, that he knew a master at Robertsbridge, a sound man and no friend of Sowerby's, who would come at a word and ask no questions, and finish the second leaf in 3 days, and hold his tongue about it forever. It was the kindest thing anyone offered her in all that spring, and it was offered without one grain of pity in it, as one solitary competent creature will hold out a hand to another, and she knew it for what it was, and she was moved by it more than she let her face say. And she said no. She said it gently, for it was the captain, but she said it whole, and she gave him the reason, standing there by the reviving fire with the cracked leaf between them, and the reason was the resolution she had told to no one. If another hand finishes them, she said, then Sowerby is right. Not in law, perhaps, but in the only court that will ever truly sit on this, my own. He says a hired smith made these gates, and my grandfather's name is a false color over another man's work. If I let a hired smith from Robertsbridge make one leaf of them, then I have made his lie true with my own consent, and I will know it, and my grandfather's shade will know it, and no touch mark I set on the iron afterward will wash it clean. These gates must be forged whole by the hands the old man taught, or they are not worth the hanging. I had rather they never hung at all than hung a lie. And Captain Reeve, who was not a man of many words, and less a man to spend them where they would not carry, looked at her a moment with his steady dark eyes, and then he did the thing that told her, more than any speech could have told her, the quality of the man. He took off his shabby blue coat and hung it on a nail, and he asked her where she would have him haul. He did not haul at the Anvil, for the drawing of the weld and the raising of the pattern were hers and hers alone, and he knew it, and would not have presumed. But there is in the finishing of great ironwork a mountain of labor that is not skilled labor, the slinging and the turning and the holding steady of murderous weights, the working of the great bellows through the long welding heats when Elias's old arms flagged, the fetching and the banking and the watching through the night that the fire held true, and all of that. In the 8 days that were left, the captain did silently, from the gray of the morning to the black of the night, sleeping 3 hours in the cottage kitchen with his top boots on and rising before her, and there grew up between the two of them in those 8 days a thing that neither of them named and neither of them hurried, a thing made all of shared labor and shared silence, and the passing of a tool from hand to hand without a word needing to be said as to which tool was wanted, the kind of understanding that comes to people who work well together at a hard thing and is worth more than any amount of speaking. And once, deep in the third night, when the cracked scroll had at last come white and clean under the welding heat, and she had drawn it whole and raised the water pattern in it true, so that the silver ripples stood again in the black iron as though the fault had never been, she looked up from the anvil and found him watching her across the fire, not the iron. And neither of them looked away as quickly as they might have, and that was all, and it was a great deal. But the thing she did in those last 8 days that mattered beyond even the finishing, the thing that was the whole hinge of all that was to come, she did alone, and in the deep of the nights when even the captain slept. And it was the working out of the resolution she had made, for she knew, none better, that when Whitson came Sowerby would not be beaten by finished gates, that a man who had drawn a hook pin to kill a child would not stand back for so honest a thing as good ironwork honestly hung, that he would come to the reconsecration with law in his pocket and a lie in his mouth, and that against a plausible forger a magistrate wants proof he can lay his hand on, proof in the thing itself that no whisper can whisper away. And she had it to give. She had it in the iron, if she would but put it there past finding. So in the setting of the leadwork, for the great scrolls of such gates are pinned and caulked with run lead at their joinings, molten lead poured into the sockets and set and dressed, work done cold and slow and by candle when the day's forging was done. In the setting of that leadwork, deep in the throat of the central scroll of each leaf where the oak leaves gathered thickest and no eye would ever think to look, she cut 2 marks. The first she cut with the very stamp her grandfather had cut his own iron with for 50 years, his touch mark. The little farrer's horseshoe and star that had come down to her in the oak chest with the pattern book, and beneath it in fine struck figures the year, the true year, this year, sunk deep and then run over with lead so that it lay hidden but whole beneath, to be found only by one who broke the lead away and knew to look. And the second mark, struck just below her grandfather's, she made with a stamp of her own, a thing she had cut for herself in the long winter and shown to nobody, her own initials, J.F., small and deep and true. She set her grandfather's mark and her own together in the throat of each gate, the dead master and the living one, the man who began the work and the woman who finished it, sunk in the iron under the run lead, where they would outlast every liar in the county and every judge who tried them. And when she had done it, she dressed the lead smooth over both, so that the gates showed nothing, gleamed nothing but their honest silver-watered scrolls, and no living soul but herself knew the marks were there. Then it wanted 3 days to Whitsun, and the overthrow was made and hung between the 2 leaf tops, the arched crown of it with its heraldic device beaten out and pierced, and the whole great pair of gates stood finished at last in the black shop, both leaves and their crown, taller than the doorway, the watered steel taking the one live glow of the banked fire and throwing it back in a rippling, moonlit silver along every scroll and leaf and acorn of them, so that even by that dull light they seemed to stir and breathe. And old Elias Kemp, who had struck iron for Abel Farrer's 40 years and had seen every fine thing that ever came off that anvil, walked the length of them once with his one good eye, and came back, and stood before Judith, and could not speak, and only took her iron-stained hand in his 2 knotted ones and held it, which from Elias was more than another man's weeping. On the last gray morning, before Whitsun, in the pale dead light before the sun was up over the birch woods, they raised the gates onto the cart. It took the whole of them and the captain's gray horse and Abel's old block and tackle rigged to the crumbling gable, and it took an hour of held breath and inched chain, but they got first one great leaf, and then the other, and then the crown lashed and cradled in straw upon the long cart bed. And Tamsin walked at the horse's head, and Bet walked at the tail with her hand on the load, as though she would steady the whole of it by will. And Elias walked at one wheel, and the captain at the other. And Judith walked before, down the rutted lane from Hartsfield through the wet spring gorse under a sky just going from slate to primrose, 3 miles to where the squat old flint and stone church of Hartsfield stood among its yews, with its 2 empty piers of worn gray stone before the door, waiting a year and more for what her grandfather had promised them. And there in the risen morning, with the dew still on the churchyard grass and not a soul yet come, they hung the gates. They swung the great hoisting tackle from the light gate oak, and they lifted the first leaf and carried it in and offered its long forged hinge pintles up to the sockets Abel had set in the stone before he died. And the pintles that a dead man had sized and a living woman had forged to match dropped home into their sockets true to a hair, and the great leaf hung, and Judith set her hand to it and swung it, and it swung silent and even and sweet on iron her grandfather had cut, and came to and stood. And then the second, and then they set the overthrow between, and made it fast, and drew away the tackle, and the cart and the straw, and stood back in the wet grass in the full risen light of the last morning before Whitsun, and looked at the thing done. The great tall pair of watered iron gates hung whole and true and swinging in their old gray piers before the church door. The oak leaves and the acorns and the arched crown of them, the silver ripple of the patterned steel running alive along every scroll under the pale sun, done, finished, forged whole and watered true, and hung before the reconsecration exactly as the will had laid upon her, against Gideon Sowerby and his poached men and his cold iron and his warned-off charcoal and his whispered lie and his drawn hook pin, and against every soul in the county who had laughed in the attorney's cold room and said that no woman living should ever be suffered to own the mystery of iron. Judith Ferrars stood in the churchyard grass with her worn hands hanging at her sides and looked at her grandfather's gates and her own. And she did not weep, for that was not her way, but she stood a long while, and the captain stood a little back from her and did not speak, and let her stand. Whitsun came in fair. The rain that had hung over the Weald the whole of that cold spring drew off in the night, and the morning broke pale and clear and washed, a thin primrose sun coming up over the birch slopes behind Hartsfield and laying a long light down the lane to the church. By 9 the bells were going in the squat flint tower, the 2 old bells that had been cracked and were now recast, ringing round and whole again over the wet grass, and by 9 the road was full. They came from all the parishes of that quarter of Sussex, on foot and on horseback and packed in farm carts, in their Whitsun best, because it is not every year that a church is consecrated anew, and it was less than never in living memory that a woman had made the iron that would hang before one. That last was the thing that brought them. Judith Ferrars had learned in the long weeks that a piece of work done against the grain of what men will allow draws 2 kinds of watcher, the sort that hopes to see it stand and the sort that comes chiefly to be there when it falls, and she had stopped some while ago, troubling to tell one kind from the other. She stood a little apart from the press of them, at the corner of the churchyard wall where the yews came down, in the same russet brown gown she had worn to the reading of the will and a clean gray wool shawl over her shoulders, her dark auburn hair drawn back plain under its linen cap, and she looked at her gates. They were hung. That was the whole of it, and it was everything. All through the gray dawn she and the captain and old Elias had toiled at the piers with the block and tackle and the long bars, and the 2 great leaves had gone up onto their hooks and swung true, swung sweet, meeting in the middle with the soft iron kiss of a thing hung right, and now under the clean Whitsun light they stood in the worn pale gray stone, as though they had stood there 100 years and would stand 100 more. The forged oak leaves ran up the scrolls in their courses, the acorns clustered under them, the heraldic device rode plain in the center of the overthrow, and along all the great curves of the scrollwork where the patterned steel caught the low sun, the watering ran that rippling silver moonlit sheen, the grain in the metal itself moving like water under ice, that no other shop in the county could raise, and that most men in the county did not believe a shop could raise at all. People went up to the gates and touched them. She watched them do it. She watched a farmer draw one blunt finger down a scroll and turn to his wife with his mouth open, and she felt none of the triumph she might once have thought she would feel, only a great level tiredness and, under it, quiet, like the quiet of a fire well banked. She had said she would make them whole, water them true, and hang them in their piers before the reconsecration, or lose everything to her cousin. They were whole. They were watered. They were hung, and it wanted a full hour yet of the bishop. He came at 10, the Bishop of Chichester, in his lawn sleeves, with the rector of the parish walking at his shoulder and the churchwardens before him, and the whole gathering fell in behind, and the service of consecration began there at the gate. It is a slow rite and a grave one, the giving back of a house to its use. And Judith stood through it, with her hands folded and her gray eyes level. And if her heart went now and then to the derelict shed on the hill, where a year ago there had been nothing but cold stone and rust, and a huge silent black anvil under a fall of dust, she gave no sign of it. The captain stood a few paces off among the other gentlemen, tall and spare, and a little stiff in the one leg, in his shabby dark blue coat, his weather-lined face turned steadily forward, and once, only once, across the heads of the crowd, his dark brown eyes found hers, and rested there a moment, and moved away. And that was all, and it was enough. Tamsin and Bet stood together near the wall, scrubbed and shining and frightened half to death in their best, holding hands like the children they still half were, and old Elias Kemp stood behind them, bald and knotted and gruff, his one clouded eye and his one good one both fixed on the gates he had helped to forge, and his jaw working slowly under its gray side whiskers as a man's jaw works who will not, before all these people, be seen to weep. The rite came to its close. The bishop turned from the gate to bless the way in, and the churchwardens stood back to open the two great leaves wide for the people to pass through into the porch. And it was in that hinge of the morning, with the iron swinging open under the bishop's own hand and the whole county drawn up to watch it, that Gideon Sowerby chose to speak. He had dressed for it. He came forward out of the front of the crowd in his claret plum broadcloth and his straining buff waistcoat, the heavy gold watch chain across him, and the cluster of fob seals turning and turning in his soft pink fingers, his high florid face composed into a great show of reluctance. And he did not shout. He had never in his life needed to shout, having learned young that a soft voice carries farther in a hushed place than a loud one, but pitched his words to reach the bishop and the rector, and, standing a little behind them in his riding coat, with his hat in his hand, the magistrate of that division, Sir Rowland Ashburnham, whom Sowerby had taken good care should be present. "My Lord Bishop," he said, "I am loath beyond expression to bring a matter of law into so sacred an hour. No man honors the day more than I, but I should be false to my dead kinsman's memory, and false to this parish, if I suffered these gates to be blessed and hung under a false name before the whole of the county, and held my peace." A stir went through the crowd like wind through standing corn. Judith did not move. She had been waiting, she found, for exactly this, had waited for it through every night of the last 3 weeks with a certainty she could not have named. And now that it came, she felt it settle on her almost with relief, the way the last blow of a long forging settles a thing at last into its true shape. Sowerby drew papers from his breast. "I hold here," he said, and his voice thickened with a beautiful sorrow, "an instrument of assignment, dated the 4th of March in this present year, signed by my late cousin Abel Ferrers in the last weeks of his life, and witnessed. By it my cousin, knowing his strength failing and doubting, as any sane man must have doubted, that the commission could be carried by the person to whom his other property fell, made over the great church gate commission entire, together with all iron and material begun toward it, to me, and to the master smith in my own employ, one Caleb Furnace of Robertsbridge, that the work might be finished by hands competent to finish it. I hold here also," and he drew out a second paper, "Furnace's bill for the completing of that same work. These gates, my lord, that you are asked this morning to bless, these gates are mine. They were made good in my shop, under my hand, at my charge. And the whole of the Hartsfield estate, which was settled upon the finishing of this very commission, falls, therefore, in law and in plain honesty, to me." He turned then, at last, and looked full at Judith across the churchyard, and the thin, oily half-smile came at last onto his mouth, though it did not even now climb so high as his small, pale, calculating eyes. "I am sorry for it," he said gently. "God knows I am sorry for it. My cousin has been ill-advised, but a church is no place for a woman's fancy, and iron is no trade for one, and there is an end." There was a silence in the churchyard then that Judith would remember all her days. A silence with the bells still faintly humming out of it, and a wood pigeon calling somewhere down the slope. And all those faces turned, the hoping ones and the waiting ones alike, from the fat man in his fine coat to the still woman by the yews. Sir Rowland Ashburnham cleared his throat and looked profoundly uncomfortable, as a country magistrate does when law is thrust upon him in his Sunday clothes, and said that this was a grave charge, a very grave charge, and that if there was a document it must of course be looked at, and that Miss Ferrars must be given her answer. And Judith Ferrars stepped forward from the wall. She did not hurry. She had learned that of the fire, if she had learned nothing else in that long spring, that the iron comes right in its own time and not in yours, and that the hand that snatches spoils the weld. She came to the gate and laid one strong iron-stained hand flat upon the cold silver-gray metal of it, almost as another woman might lay a hand on the shoulder of a child, and she turned and faced them. And when she spoke her voice was low and even and carried farther than Sowerby's, for it's very quiet. "My Lord Bishop. Sir Rowland, my cousin has told you what is written on his paper. Let me tell you what is written in the iron." She ran her hand up the near scroll to where the great curve of it turned back on itself in a boss of forged leaves, and she said, "A gate may be counterfeited on paper by any man who can hire a hand to hold a pen. It cannot be counterfeited in the metal. When my grandfather Abel Ferrars set his mark to a piece of work, and he set it to every piece he ever made whole, man and boy, for 52 years, he did not sign it where a thief might file it off. He struck it deep, and he hid it, and he taught the hiding of it to one living soul, which was myself at his knee, when I was a girl of 7, and my cousin yonder was already a grown man who thought the reading of iron beneath him." She turned to the churchwardens. "Bring the bishop's own people close, and bring my cousin close, and bring any man here who can be trusted to say true what he sees. On the underside of this boss, where the leadwork of the scroll is run to bed the joint, put your fingers into the hollow of it, out of the weather, where no eye finds it that does not know to look. You will feel a touch mark struck into the iron before ever the lead was run. It is my grandfather's mark. It is a heart's head over the letters A.F., and beneath it the date he began this work, struck in his own figures. And beside it, smaller, is a second mark, struck by me on the night I closed the last scroll, not 4 days since. It is my own. It is the same heart's head, and beneath it the letters J.F. and this present year." She stood back. "Read the iron," she said. "It cannot lie, and it cannot be hired." They read it. The rector himself, a dry, cautious man, went down on his knees on the wet stone in his surplice, with no thought at all for the surplice, and put his hand up under the boss of the scroll into the shadowed hollow of the leadwork, and his face changed. He drew his fingers along the hidden metal slowly, the way a blind man reads, and he said, in a voice gone suddenly unsteady, "There is a mark here." "There are, my lord, there are 2 marks here. A stag's head, and letters and figures, struck deep, and no man could have set them here after the lead was run, for the lead is run over the edge of them. And a low sound went through the crowd. But Sowerby was quick. He had always been quick. That was his gift, the quickness of the man who has prepared the ground, and he said smoothly, loudly now, that a mark was nothing, that his cousin might have struck any mark she pleased into iron she had had these 3 weeks in her own hands, that a hidden scratch proved a woman's cunning, and nothing beside, and that the assignment was witnessed and dated and stood in law above any smith's private trickery. And it was there that he overreached, and Judith let him do it, watching him with her level gray eyes, letting the rope run out. For the magistrate, unhappy, turned to her and asked was there more than the marks. For the man was right that a mark, struck secretly, was hard to date, and Judith said, "There is the whole of the iron, Sir Rowland. There is the steel itself." And she sent Tamsin running, fleet as a hare in her Sunday shoes, up the lane to the forge, and the girl came back panting, with the great locked oak chest borne between herself and Bet, the cipher-pattern book of Abel Furrers, the coated chest of sketches and recipes that was the true inheritance, the thing her cousin could not have used had it been laid in his very hands, because he could not read one line of it. She opened it there on the churchyard wall before them all, and she called for the master smiths, for she had thought of this too in the long nights, and had not left it to chance. There were 3 master smiths in the gathering that she had asked the rector privately to summon, grave guild-sworn men who had known her grandfather and who owed neither her nor Sowerby anything. Josiah Hook, warden of the Smiths' Company at Lewes, 70 years old and straight as a bar, and Master Coleman, who had a great shop by the Ouse, and one other from over toward the forest, all 3 of them men who had laughed, or had stood by while others laughed, in the cold room a year ago when it was said that no woman living could be suffered to own the mystery of iron. She had asked them not to judge her. She had asked them only to look. And now she laid the pattern book open to the leaf where her grandfather had set down, in his own tight cipher of little strokes and dots and figures that looked to the uninstructed eye like the tracks of a bird, the recipe for the watered steel, the exact count of the bars, the metals of them, the number of the foldings, the heats, the whole long guarded secret of the pattern welding that gave the scrolls their silver sheen, and beside the open book she had the men lay a cut end of one of the very bars from which the gates were forged, an off-cut she had etched and polished, so that the watering showed in it plain. "You cannot read the book," she said to them, without unkindness. "He taught it to no one but me, but you can read the iron, for you have forged 40 years apiece. Look at the count of the pattern in the steel. Count the folds in it. Then let me read you off the book what count he wrote, and you shall say whether the one is the other." And old Josiah Hook bent his white head over the etched steel a long time, turning it in the Whitsun light, and over the strange bird-track figures he could not read. And when he straightened, his lined face had gone still and grave, and he said, loud enough for the bishop and the magistrate and every soul in that churchyard to hear him, "I have forged iron in this county for 50 year, and I knew Abel Ferrers before this young woman's mother was born, and I will say what I see and be damned to any man's paper. No shop in England made this steel but Hartsfield. There is not another hand living I know of that can raise this watering. Abel could do it, and he took the manner of it, we all supposed, into the ground with him. And here it stands, new made, 4 days old, in a church gate, and here beside it is the old man's own receipt for it, and the counts agree, ripple for ripple, fold for fold. This is Ferrers' iron. and it was never yet forged in Robertsbridge nor anywhere else by a man named Furniss. For if Caleb Furniss could raise this steel, he'd be the first master in the kingdom, and none of us would ever have heard his name spoke small. The other two masters said the same, in fewer words. And that was the breaking of it. After that it went quickly, the way a thing long propped goes quickly once the prop is drawn. Sir Roland Ashburnham, no longer uncomfortable now, but grown cold and upright and every inch the king's justice, took Sowerby's 2 papers into his own hands and read them, there in the sun, aloud, slowly, line by line before the whole county, and reading them so. In the open air, with the truth of the iron standing behind him, he read the lie straight out of them. For the assignment was dated the 4th of March, and the magistrate observed, in his dry courtroom voice, that he himself had dined with the attorney Mr. Locksley not a fortnight since, and had learned that Abel Ferrars had been past holding a pen since the middle of February, and had signed his own true will by a made mark witnessed by 2 men, being unable in his last illness to write his name, so that a firm, clear signature dated the 4th of March was not the signature of a dying man at all, but the copy of a well one. And he observed that the witness named upon the assignment was one Caleb Furniss's own brother. And he observed that the bill for the finishing of the work was dated to a week when, by the sworn word of the charcoal burner and the carter and the captain and the girls, the gates had stood half forged in the Hartsfield shed under Judith Ferris's own hammer, with no Robertsbridge man within 20 mile of them. This instrument, said Sir Roland at the last, folding it up with 2 fingers as a man folds something he does not care to soil his hand upon, is a forgery. It is a forgery clumsy in its dating and impudent in its witnessing, and it has been laid before a bishop in a churchyard on Whitsun morning to rob a woman of her own honest work and her grandfather's roof. Mr. Sowerby, you will attend me at the sessions. And Gideon Sowerby, whose soft pink hands had never in his life been truly blackened by the trade he had tried to steal, stood in his fine claret coat before the turned faces of the whole county, the same faces he had worked upon so patiently with his rumors and his quiet moneys through all the cold spring, and had the one coin he had ever truly hoarded, which was his good name and his credit, taken out of him and spent in the open where every soul could watch it go. He did not bluster. That was perhaps the worst of it for him, that there was nothing left to bluster with. He turned once and looked at his cousin, and Judith looked back at him with no triumph in her grave gray eyes and no pity either, only a kind of level finish as one looks at a fire that is out. And then he put on his hat and went out through the crowd, and the crowd made way for him in a silence more terrible than any hooting, and he was gone. Now I promised you, away back at the beginning of this, in the cold streaming light of the attorney's window, that in the way of these slow, true tales, I would tell you how the wheel comes round before ever I turned it, and here it is turned, and I have kept my word, and there is only the quiet after to tell. The bishop, being a sensible man as well as a holy one, said that the gates should most certainly be blessed, for they were honest iron honestly come by, and there was no impediment in law nor in grace. And he blessed them, and the church of Hartsfield was consecrated anew, with Abel Ferrars's last work, and his granddaughter's first swinging open before its door. And the county went in to worship, and came out again into the pale sun, and went home. And Judith Ferrars kept Hartsfield. The cottage was hers, and the long, low soot-blackened shed on the bracken edge of the hill was hers, and the huge black anvil on its worn oak stump that had stood a whole year silent, and the tall crumbling chimney, and the cipher chest, and the fire. She reopened the works. She had never meant, whatever the county supposed, to make one pair of gates and then sit down a lady. She had meant to be a smith, which was the only thing her grandfather had ever taught her to be, and the only thing she had ever wished to be. And she was won now by the word of the wardens of the company themselves, who could hardly go on saying no woman could hold the mystery of iron after old. Josiah Hook had sworn before a bishop that no man but a Ferrers could raise the watered steel, and she set girls at the anvils. Tamson, sturdy and red-cheeked and grown broad and sure in the arms over that one hard spring, became her first hand and her striker. And thin, watchful Bet, whose wary eyes had learned at last to hold steady on the cherry-red heat and read it true, became her second. And after them, as the years went on and the shop's name spread, there came other girls, the girls that no master would take, the turned away and the too many daughtered, and the ones the world had already, in its careless way, given up for spoiled. And Judith took them in and set hammers in their hands, and taught them the fire and the striking and the drawing down and the reading of the color in the heat. And in time she taught the cleverest and the most patient of them the cipher itself, so that the manner of the watered steel should never again go so near to dying in the ground with one old man. And old Elias Kemp worked the great bellows for her to the very last of his years, gruff and few-worded and half-blind and content, and lived to see the shed he had kept out of grief and stubbornness ring loud again from Michaelmas to Michaelmas. And when at length he died, he was buried within sound of the Anvil, which was the only music he had ever cared for. And Captain Nathaniel Reeve, who had lent her charcoal in a cart and his belief in the black of that first winter, and had asked nothing, and had stood watch through the bad nights, and had helped her rig the heavy iron with his own stiff, careful hands, and had never once in all of it offered her the insult of his pity nor the greater insult of a rescue, Captain Reeve she accepted, in the fullness of a slower time, quietly and equally, when the accepting could be no bargain and no gratitude and no debt, but only the plain choosing of one solitary competent soul by another. They were married in the Flint Church at Hartsfield, and she walked into it, if you care to know, through her own gates, under her grandfather's mark, and her own struck beside it in the hidden lead, with the silver watering running up the scrolls in the low light, and that seemed to her, who had small use for ceremony, the truest word that could be said over the two of them, and word enough. And that, at the fireside, is the whole of it. But I would have you carry one thing away from it, into the dark and the cold outside, for it was never, whatever the title of the thing, a tale about a gate, no more than it was ever truly about a will, or a wicked cousin, or the laughter of a company of guild-sworn men in a cold room. Those were only the shapes the trouble took. What the tale was about, under all of it, is a thing so plain that the world spends most of its breath denying it, that the things the world gives up for dead are so very seldom truly dead. They are only stopped, only banked, like a good fire raked over at night against the morning, gone gray on the top, gone cold to the careless hand, given over by everyone who walks past for finished and out. A cold hearth, a silent anvil, an old man's craft supposed buried with him, a penniless woman of 27 that a whole county had already, kindly, written down as beaten. All of it banked, not out, all of it waiting, under the gray, for the one thing that raises any dead fire back to its life, which is not luck, and is not rescue, and is not the leave of the men who own the mystery, but only, ever, one pair of hands that knows the work and will not walk away. That is the whole secret of the watered steel, and of a great deal else besides. So if you are sitting tonight by some cold hearth of your own that the world has told you will never catch again, I would have you remember Judith Ferrers at her banked fire, and take up the bellows, and try. Stay a while longer here by the warmth with me, if the night is hard and the road is long. And if this quiet hour has been a comfort to you, if you would like to sit by this fire again when the next such tale is told, then let the little bell below be rung, and stay near, and I will leave a light in the window for you, as one leaves a light for the next cold traveler on the road, so that you may always find your way back to the warmth. Rest now. The fire is good, and the gate is hung, and the work goes on.